Right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Epra Sustainability Summit. It's great to have so many people on the session this afternoon. As with everything, this is a very different session to the session that we had last year when we were all together in London. However, clearly the carbon footprint on this format is significantly lower this afternoon, and we were able to welcome even more people to the session. I think there were over 260 people registered this afternoon, which is fantastic to see. So these are really positive outcomes which we may wish to keep as we think about future sessions going forward. Another big change this year has been the focus on all three elements of ESG. People do seem to have stopped asking me if I think sustainability is going to drop off the agenda as the economic outlook is so difficult. It seems to be becoming clear that sustainability is both a critical part of the way out of the current economic challenge and also essential to us avoiding an even bigger one as the impacts of climate change accelerate. The grim reality of climate change and climate risk has accelerated the drive for a better understanding of how this is and will affect real assets and the best ways to manage and mitigate these impacts. The focus on governance is pushing increased transparency, generating more and better data for decision making, and making business impacts more explicit to all of our stakeholder groups. This in itself is driving further change as consumers and colleagues, alongside investors and others, expect businesses to take responsibility for the impacts we are having. And this, of course, relates to our social impact as well as environmental. And this has also been a big focus of attention in 2020, as our communities, particularly for retail, but for other sectors too, have been so badly affected by the shutting down of our towns and cities. As an industry, we both rely on and support the communities in which we operate, and many businesses have stepped up to try and help this year. Clearly, there will be an even greater need for this in 2021. All these issues have influenced the agenda we have put together for this afternoon, which covers the need for radical change, the role of international policy, the response for the investor community, and the actions and reactions of the corporates. So I'm confident that by the end of the programme today, we will all have something useful, new and interesting to take away. So let's get to it. It's my great pleasure to be able to hand over to our opening session featuring Jonathon Porrit, co-founder of Forum for the Future and one of the foremost influencers on climate change. Jonathon has a distinguished pedigree in business, policy and campaigning, and I might add a book out that is pretty much essential reading for everyone on the session this afternoon. He's being interviewed by Anya Sitaram, founding director and executive producer of Rockhopper TV, a London-based production company that specialises in documentaries on development, environment and global health. For many years, Anya was a familiar face on British television, both as a reporter and newsreader at Sky News and BBC World News. This is sure to make an interesting conversation. So, Anya, Jonathon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Louise, and also to EPRA for inviting me to take part in today's event. I'm very pleased to be here today for the two keynote interviews with two experts in sustainability. We had, of course, veteran environmentalist Jonathon Porrit, and later we're going to be talking to Stefan Moser from the European Commission. So over the last 30 years in my career as a television journalist, a correspondent, a newsreader, and now a documentary producer, Jonathon Porrit has always been, shall we say in today's parlance, an influencer, and he certainly influenced me. So you can imagine my excitement when I found out I was going to have to spend 35 minutes or so interviewing him. So I won't hog him completely. I do hope you'll send your questions in, which you can do so in the chat function. So, do send them in right from the beginning. So just to say, Jonathon Porrit has had a long career championing sustainability. He was director of Friends of the Earth. He was chair of the UK Government Sustainable Development Commission. And for the last 25 years, he's been working, well, he was the founder and is working for the Forum for the Future, a not-for-profit that has been working with business and government to create a sustainable future. And as we heard there, he's also a prolific writer, and his latest book has just come out. It's called Hope in Hell: a decade to confront the climate emergency. And Jonathon, welcome to today's event. Thank you very much. And I just want to pick up on your book there. It's a great title. What do you mean by we've got a decade to confront the climate emergency?
Thanks, Anya. And thank you, Louise, for the introduction. Deliberately chosen words, because you will have noticed, Anya, at the moment, the politicians love talking about 2050 right now. Everything's phrased in terms of net zero by 2050, and that's far enough away to keep politicians reasonably protected from the reality of what needs to happen now, as in this decade, between now and 2030. And that's because the science around this is very clear. It's what we do in the next 10 years, which will have the greatest bearing on prospects for maintaining a relatively stable climate through the rest of this century. That's essentially the story. And if we can really go after these 10 years now, then the prospects for making a safer climate for us by 2050 and then through to the end of the century are greatly enhanced. So we have to focus now on the next 10 years if we're going to make a real difference.
Yeah, so a sort of tipping point, as you say. But this year, well, in fact, only yesterday, we had a report out from the World Meteorological Organization saying that this has been one of the hottest years on record. And also we had the UN Secretary General making various dire warnings about the state we're in. But it was also going to be a key year in terms of talks and decisions taken. There was an oceans conference which was postponed, and of course COP26, which was meant to take part this month, has also been postponed. How much of a setback do you think that is?
It's been a difficult year for the climate cause, let's be honest. It hasn't made anything easier. It was right to postpone COP26 because it wouldn't have been able to deliver what it needs to deliver. But on the other hand, what that means is that all sorts of things that should have happened by now, including every country redefining its own climate ambition, have been postponed at the same time. So it hasn't been a good year, but let's just take stock of some pretty important things that have happened this year. Firstly, before the US scene, which I'll come on to in a moment, China decided that this was the time for it to actually contribute a hard-edged target for net zero by 2060. Now, I've just been rude about 2050, so you might say, well, what's the point of a 2060 target? The point is that China has the biggest challenge of any country in the world to decarbonize its economy fast enough. And really critical from the point of view of the built environment, because much of what China has to do on the decarbonization story is around the built environment. That has now been backed up, if you like, by the election of Joe Biden as the next president of the USA and as Kamala Harris as his vice president, who is a real champion for environmental justice and the low carbon economy. Their commitments are in a different league from what we've seen before. So there's a $2 trillion recovery program based on decarbonization and low carbon prosperity and environmental justice. So the EU has got a pretty big package. I don't want to take anything away from that. It's a really significant story that is now being taken forward within the EU, but this is massive. So there are lots of good things going on. And the last thing I'd add to that list, Anya, is that during the course of 2020, even though it has been a very difficult year, the momentum has been sustained by the private sector, regardless of the COVID impacts. So if you go back to March this year, you can track one corporate commitment after another, one big global multinational company after another, one trade association or industry body after another, stepping forward with increasingly ambitious decarbonization targets of their own. And that for me is enormously important because obviously we're not going to make this transition through to the next milestone in 2030 and then on to 2050 without the wholesale commitment of the private sector to help deliver the bits of the process they need to.
Right, thank you. And I'm going to talk a bit more about the private sector and the work they're doing and what they can do later on. I'm just going to bring in a couple of questions actually that are starting to come in already. So without sidetracking us completely onto different topics, I do want to ask you this though, because I know that in your book you talk about young people and what they have done to tackle climate change and what they're doing to tackle the emergency. What do you think of Extinction Rebellion? That's a question that's just come in from
Right. Okay. Well, 2019 was pretty remarkable, both from the perspective of Extinction Rebellion suddenly emerging in our lives, and as you said, Anya, from the perspective of young people, and their very different take on what you might call intergenerational justice, as in what one generation owes all those generations that come after it. Both of these two elements, I believe, are extremely significant. And I think we will continue to see civil disobedience in general, including the kind of nonviolent direct action that we've seen from Extinction Rebellion, but not exclusively that. I think they will become even more influential in 2021 and on from this point. Personally, I think it is the role of young people which will prove to be even more influential, because there's an authenticity and an anger in the voice that they're raising, which is very, very hard for politicians in general, but all of us adults, if you like, in general, simply to set to one side and say, yeah, well, we're doing the best we can. That's not the message that we're getting from young people. They know we're not doing the best we can. They absolutely know that. And for me, that is going to become an increasingly important part of the pressure.
Right. Okay. Well, we heard there about the fantastic plans the Americans have, the recovery plan, China, and you also mentioned the EU. So last month, the European Parliament and EU member states agreed its long-term budget and also the recovery plan of 1.8 trillion euros, so a pretty substantial amount, with the aim of building a greener, more digital and more resilient Europe. So do you think that the temporary recovery instrument, known as the Next Generation EU, can be truly transformative?
I do. I absolutely do. And I really welcome what's happened, because there's no question this is stepping up in a big way. It needs, of course, to be backed by member countries in the EU coming forward with their own equally ambitious recovery programs. And to be honest, we haven't seen anything like as much of that as we need. So I would say right now, it's only France and Germany that have actually matched that cross-EU ambition level. And that's going to be a big story as each individual nation comes forward with its own nationally determined contribution. There'll be a EU-wide contribution, of course, which is important. So for me, it's critical. A couple of things I just flag as to why. Firstly, a very strong emphasis in the total package on the idea of low carbon prosperity. So decarbonizing our economies as fast as we can, as cost effectively as we can. Personally, I was also delighted that the whole story about climate justice was included in the total package, as in make sure we don't do this in such a way that it further disadvantages those who already are on the sharp end of an economy that isn't really directly benefiting them. Make sure we do this in a way that helps those who are currently dependent on or employed in the fossil fuel industries across Europe. Make sure that we can do this in such a way that they too can feel part of this transition. Frankly, we wouldn't have kept countries like Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic on board with this ambitious plan if it hadn't been for that emphasis on the just transition, and Germany too, of course. So that's going to become a very big part of the total story. But Annie, we do need consistency here. I do like this package, but on the other hand, what does the EU go and do a few weeks after committing to such a package? It pretty much rolls over the current common agricultural policy, which is a very environmentally unfriendly and carbon intensive contributor to our problems. We're not talking about agriculture today, but we have to see consistency across the piece for this to work.
Well, there are some people who've said that the Green Deal, which was announced at this time last year, has been watered down as a result of the COVID pandemic, and perhaps some of the commitments, such as the farm to fork strategy, have been dropped quietly.
It's inevitable that some governments and some lobbying interests have taken advantage of COVID-19 to say this isn't the right time to do this. That is obviously part of the deal. But there is an equally strong set of voices, as you know, saying this is the moment to do it. We are going to be investing trillions of dollars between now and the end of next year in stimulus packages of one kind or another across the world. I mean, it is an extraordinary amount of money, somewhere between 12 and $14 trillion is the latest count. So it really matters that those stimulus packages are directed towards what I'm calling low carbon prosperity, towards radical decarbonization stories. Because if we don't do that, this is a literally unique opportunity. We're not going to find another $12 trillion flowing into the global economy against one common perspective, one common purpose, which is to rebuild our economies so we can continue to meet people's needs and expectations. I subscribe to that view. I'm a realist, however, right now. The flow of money, recovery money, is definitely weighted to yesterday's dying industries. So all the fossil fuels and extractive and carbon intensive industries against the interests of tomorrow's sunrise industries in the new economy, in the digital economy, in this ultra low carbon economy of the kind that we're seeing. So as of now, we need to put the politicians on watch. They're not doing as good a job as they need to do prioritizing the low carbon prosperity of the future. And you can see I'm being very careful not to single out the UK as one of the worst performers in this area, which they are.
Right, okay. Well, let's say this is an EU-wide thing. Let's be very diplomatic.
Exactly. I'm sticking to that line. Don't worry.
So just, today is very different because our audience are either working in or have an interest in real estate in the industry. And I hazard a guess that many of you, the audience watching today, are at home. You might have been in the office usually, but you're probably working from home. And Jonathon, the conversation we might have had a year ago would have been perhaps about city centres and perhaps talking about them as only somewhere where the super wealthy could live and where there could be social housing. But things have changed so much now that in fact city centres are emptying. Their workplaces are empty, office buildings are empty, retail outlets have been suffering, the businesses who rent them have been suffering. So have city centres had their day? Is this another opportunity perhaps to build back better, maybe somewhere else?
It is certainly an inflection point in terms of city centres. There's no question about that. It's premature to come up with a definitive judgment as to the impact, the longer term impact that COVID will have on retail property in general and on people's working patterns. Those are the two key things that we're talking about here. I don't think there's any doubt at all that we will see changes in people's work patterns. I doubt it'll be as extreme as some people talk about, which is huge numbers of people continuing to work exclusively from home. I don't believe that's the case, but I think we will see a lot more hybrid working patterns, hybrid arrangements, because it works for employers as well as for employees. And that is undoubtedly going to have a big impact on city centres. There's no question about that. And I'm looking at Forum for the Future's partners right now and just getting a scale of the change in their office requirements, for instance. If you combine that with our retail partners who are looking at the implications of so much business now going online, that's going to totally transform the demand for retail space. So these two things are both huge. Just very quickly to answer your question, does that mean that cities are sort of going to die in front of our eyes and that we'll all be living in urban environments full of stranded assets and hopelessly disappointed investors? I don't think that's the case, to be honest. I don't think that's likely to happen. But the two messages I would draw out from this, if you like, is the importance of flexible design with the new build. So inevitably, we're going to see more emphasis on flexible design, options for repurposing buildings in the uncertain times ahead of us, which I think is on the whole a really good thing. And I think we will see impact on valuations. I think it's inevitable that that will actually affect urban and inner city property, the property market in general. I don't see that at all as a disaster for cities. Cities have always flexed to take account of different conditions in the economy. What the challenge is, of course, for everybody on a call like this is how do you make those judgment calls that you're required to make on behalf of your investors and your clients so that you are well positioned in dealing with some of that uncertainty in the urban environment and well prepared to pick up on some of the benefits which will flow from it. That's the question. I don't think it's an existential threat to cities. Certainly don't think it's an existential threat to those dealing with real estate at all. People are still going to need the best buildings to deliver the best possible outcomes for them for whatever purpose it might be. So for me, it's a pretty big change, but it's certainly not terminal in the way that some people are making out.
So you talked earlier about the commitment of the corporate sector. I just wondered if you could expand a little bit more on that, about the kind of things that people are doing. Apart from making commitments, what are they actually doing? I mean, what targets are there for them to try and match? You know, where's the governance? Are they creating it themselves?
It's a good question. And I think actually it's a very important point because I'm thinking about your next interview already, Anya, with Stefan Moser, because I am not one of these who believe that this incredibly accelerated decarbonization story can be delivered purely by companies voluntarily making the changes that are necessary. I believe that the core of this is good regulation, smart, transparent, accountable regulation over time, giving any particular business in a particular sector enough forward planning space so they can make the changes that are required. And in the built environment, we all know what that means. You can't suddenly change horses or courses in the middle of a year or in the middle of a particular period of time. You have to lay it out for people so they know what this means. For me, that means the zero carbon agenda for anybody involved in the built environment is going to become critical. And that is why the role that Stefan plays, who I see as the kind of EU's efficiency guru, if you like, is absolutely critical to this, because part of this has to be driven by absolutely clear regulatory standards as to milestones by which we need to deliver improvements in the efficiency of all built assets, And I'm actually very nervous now that the UK will no longer be part of the EU, because we've never acknowledged the huge contribution that has come from improvements in efficiency in appliances as well as in buildings. If you look at the decarbonization successes of the last 10 years, a lot of that has not been delivered by fancy new technology or by renewable energy or whatever it might be. A lot of that has been delivered by good old-fashioned emphasis on energy efficiency. And a lot of that, to avoid competitive issues within any one sector, has to be driven by regulation. Lots for companies to do once you establish the regulatory base. That's where you'll see the real leadership. And I believe that they are stepping up to do that in pretty much every sector, to be honest. And you get this sense of excitement, even in what are called the hard to abate sectors, steel and concrete and carbon intensive transport systems like shipping and railways and so on. You still get this sense, okay, we are going to be part of this, and we have to be, and we have to join this kind of gang of progressive companies within the next decade.
What do you mean by good old-fashioned energy efficiency?
I mean, telling every single company in a particular sector that after a certain date, they will no longer be able to manufacture and sell appliances that are transparently not helpful from a sustainability point of view. So just being absolutely directive about the minimum expectations for any provider of any appliance. And equally, of course, if you're talking about zero carbon buildings, you need to establish exactly what the baseline is. And we do have a really sad and sorry example of what happens when you don't rely on good, smart regulation. So here in the UK, we had one of the most, I think, most forward-looking plans to bring forward zero carbon housing. It was introduced in the 2000s, and it was very clearly laid out. There were milestones along the way. The standards, the building regulations ratcheted up bit by bit. And the Conservative government in 2015 decided that all of that was too prescriptive, too regulatory, too much of a burden on business. And they responded to the pressure from the volume house builders here in the UK. Total tragedy, because had we stuck with those regulated baselines, every single new home in the UK from next year onwards would have been built to near zero carbon standards. Whereas now we won't be going back to that until 2025, a lost decade because of a failure to understand the critical nature of regulation to create the floor on which then the really good companies, creative, dynamic, progressive companies, add the extra value for their shareholders.
So there's another challenge there, because most of Europe's building stock is built before 1970. It's pretty old and it doesn't meet energy standards. So what can the private sector do in terms of renovation? It's very expensive, isn't it? I mean, you can understand why perhaps builders resisted some of those stronger regulations.
It can be expensive. It doesn't need to be expensive. And technology is as supportive of this agenda, the retrofit agenda, as it is of the new build agenda. We're seeing a lot of things that can now be done in terms of lighting systems, for instance, heating, ventilation systems, even very simple issues around heat recovery, which are beginning to make a real difference, designing in all of this into your retrofit plans. And you can go back 15, 20 years, Anya, and you can look at quite remarkable blueprints which were already available to us in the built environment, saying, this is how you can do retrofit. It is much better to do it across the piece. It is more efficient to take on whole areas in order to get the efficiencies of scale in that regard. But there's no shortage of knowledge in the sector about how to do this and to keep costs very manageable. A lot of course, goes to the question of landlords, the people who own the buildings, the asset owners, if you like. Are the asset owners going to step up and understand what their contribution is to a net zero economy of the future? And one of the things we pick up more and more in Forum at the moment is complaints from tenants who are users of this real estate not having sufficiently smart landlords to drive a process of change of which they are both then co-beneficiaries. That's for me, a big question, which is why I've emphasized some of the regulatory systems which can not leave landlords, owners, asset owners, with the choice they have at the moment, which is either to disregard this agenda completely as not being relevant to them, or to get on the bus and do the things that they know they could do if they really applied themselves to it. So the retrofit story for Europe's built environment, as you say, is critical. It is actually much more important than the new build. Shouldn't really say that, but it is, in terms of the net carbon gain, the retrofit story, the efficiency story, is much more important than the new build.
Thank you, Jonathan. And to those of you watching, do keep sending your questions in. I do have a couple there, which I'm going to ask in a minute, but I just want to ask Jonathan another one that I've got up my sleeve, which is talking about, you talked about the sort of asset owners there, and I'm thinking about the investors and the real estate investors. How do we drive investments towards green?
We've got good examples of investors now thinking much more proactively about what this means for them. The whole concept of climate risk is a very real and active discussion now amongst investors. It was once a kind of footnote, any other business on a board agenda for investors. It absolutely isn't now. The whole story about climate risk is right up there. There's a much higher level of priority given to this now by decision makers in capital markets. So I'm confident, actually, that investors will begin to understand that their investments are best protected by being absolutely on the learning curve here, de-risking their portfolios as much as they possibly can to ensure that they're well placed for what will be pretty dramatic disruptive changes coming down the system at us. And very heartened, actually, by the number of big institutional investors, mainstream investors, who are out there now saying this is an active part of our investment strategy over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. So you might see that as a big block on things. As soon as investors begin to see that their interests and the interests of their shareholders are better protected by being absolutely on the ball when it comes to climate risk and opportunities through a low carbon economy, then market shift. People begin to see things very differently.
Got a question come in. How do we get policy to focus on retrofit rather than new build?
Retrofit politicians' brains is literally the only thing I can suggest. It's such a good question. You can't. It's impossible to imagine the cumulative damage done to all of our lives by having a whole generation of politicians for whom energy efficiency was somehow irrelevant and were driven far more by the, upbeat excitement of let's have a new large power station over here, or let's have another great whack of infrastructure doing this, and energy efficiency somewhere right down the list of things that really matter. Now, we've got an opportunity to do that differently now. We have a body here in the UK called the National Infrastructure Commission, which is a really important advisory body. In fact, it's the principal advisory body to government on major infrastructure decisions over the course of the next 30, 40 years. And one of the most important things they did was to say to our government here in the UK that retrofit and energy efficiency ought to be treated with the same seriousness as investment in new infrastructure, whether that be around roads or dealing with ports or whatever it might be. You've got to put retrofit and efficiency in that category of things on which future prosperity absolutely depends. But we've struggled, Annie, I'm not going to make any bones about this. We've struggled with a generation of politicians who, for various reasons, just thought this agenda was, it sounds a bit odd, but almost below them. It was almost sort of too gritty and somebody else will do that stuff. It's not the kind of exciting thing that I want to be associated with. So we've all suffered because of that.
So do we need a really aggressive carbon tax?
This would help a great deal, I have to say. We all operate in market-based economies all around the world. Market-based economies work pretty much on the signals that that market is sending out to wealth creators and investors in people's capacity to create wealth. If we can narrow the gap between price and cost, so the old economists' rationale that markets work best when the price that you pay for something accurately reflects its true cost, that is the essence of optimized efficient markets. And obviously at the moment, we're not paying anything for the externalization of our greenhouse gases and the burden that that is placing on people's lives today, let alone on people's lives tomorrow. This isn't quite, we have modest internalization mechanisms. We do have the EU's ETS. For instance, we have a carbon floor price here in the UK, but this is wholly inadequate. And the best way of internalizing these very problematic externalities is through a carbon tax, in my opinion. I don't want to get into an arcane debate about whether trading systems are better to manage this transition than taxation. For me, the simplicity of a carbon tax levied on every single unit of hydrocarbon energy coming into the economy makes it far harder for people to game that and much more transparent for business to understand where the carbon price is going to be at a given point. So if everybody in this sector, for instance, in the real estate sector, knew right now, today in 2020, that there would be a cross-EU carbon price of, let's say, $100 a ton by 2025. I'm being a bit outrageous for the sake of it, but just imagine everybody knew that, and everybody responsible for making complex decisions about capex and portfolio management and so on. And you knew that come 2025 or whenever, that all that externalized cost at the moment would have to come onto the P&L, onto your P&L at that point. Decisions would obviously change dramatically, because you would be taking decisions in the interest of your shareholders, as you do now, but those interests would be better protected by getting ahead of a decarbonization story rather than waiting to be hit between the eyeballs by a tax that you then wouldn't be able to avoid.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm going to ask you another question. Just read it. It's just come into the chat box. Would you agree that the notion that we should all be prioritizing giving our capital to those companies that retrofit rather than develop? So yes, invest in retrofit.
I can't give a simple yes to that question. One of my most privileged roles at the moment, I'm a non-executive director of a contracting company, a construction company called Wilmot Dixon here in the UK, and we build a lot of new buildings, and they are critical still. We're mostly in the public estate, as it were, so public sector buildings, schools and hospitals and things like that, rather than the private sector, but we do some work in the private sector as well. But no, we're still going to need new build. Don't get me wrong. I hope I wasn't being too either or about that. We still need new buildings, and we need them to be built to the highest possible standards. So tiny little plug, we do quite a lot of passive house build here in the UK. I wish we could do a lot more. I wish we had clients in the public sector who said, yeah, we want to work with you, but we're not going to work with you unless you can deliver a passive house standard in whatever asset it is that we're now seeking. That would put the increased incentivization on us to come up with different ways of doing that new build. So all I'm saying is that if governments wanted to get the new build agenda right, they could do it almost overnight. They could set the standards through legislated minima, as in you cannot put up a new building unless you meet these standards, and you must meet them by X 2020, whatever. It's a relatively simple problem to solve for if you had politicians who were responding to the climate emergency as we see it today. Retrofit is always going to be more complicated. It's harder to work through the planning because there are so many different asset classes you have to think about. We haven't talked much about retrofit in the domestic sector, for instance, in the housing sector. That is not an easy challenge. And we know that here in the UK with some of the poorest quality housing anywhere in Europe. So keep the balance. But for me, the story from a carbon point of view is going to be driven more by the retrofit and efficiency story than by the new build story.
Okay, so just give me an example of where it's working well.
The retrofit story, okay. Well, there's been a lot of work done on this in Australia, for instance, is a country which I'm reasonably familiar with. And for a long time now, both the new build market and the retrofit market has had pretty demanding standards imposed upon it, both at the federal level and at state level. They have a number of different systems which are driven into the building regulations, the equivalent to the building regulations, so that these are the starting point for whatever it is that any company is seeking, any construction company is seeking to do in that sector. I'm not aware of the leading country in the EU from a retrofit perspective. Which country would be able to claim we've done the best job on this of any country in Europe? The only example I'm familiar with is Germany, where by virtue of the emphasis they have on the lender, on the individual regions or states within Germany, and a bank that is specifically purpose-built to provide funding for retrofit, the German story is pretty amazing to look at because they cracked the funding model. As you actually, I think you said, Anya, earlier on in one of your questions, retrofit depends on getting the finances and the financing right. And of all the examples I know in the EU, but that's from a relatively limited knowledge base, let me be honest. But of all the examples, I think it's Germany that has pushed that one furthest and fastest.
So some kind of green mortgages might work.
Yes, I mean, because these are retrofit schemes, they are financing models that allows the owner of the asset, because they have much more rented property in Germany than private home ownership, but it allows the owner of that asset to take advantage of discounted loan products, essentially, to make the investments necessary in improving their assets.
And another question that's come in, what role can consumers play? Because here we are talking on the big picture, but when you get down to the average person, all this can feel very far removed. What can the consumer do in all of this?
Yeah, this is a question I've wrestled with for many a long year, because to a certain extent, one wants to be able to say that this is a change process that could be driven by us as consumers, us as investors, us as citizens. So it could be driven from that place. I don't think that's the case, Anya. I think consumers, individuals, have a big contribution to make. But if you think about the conversation we've just been having up until now, to get these huge gains from energy efficiency, from a reduced greenhouse gas emissions story, you have to rely on governments and on large companies in each sector. Consumers would love to, for instance, to know that all the appliances that they were buying were coming with the lowest possible carbon footprint, the lowest possible resource impact on the rest of the world, zero human rights abuses, and that all of that stuff, if they could use their own personal purchasing power to do that, would be delivered. They'll never be able to get to that point. So I'm very interested now on the EU's approach to demanding that manufacturers in the appliance sector must now design for disassembly and reuse. Now, no amount of consumer pressure would ever get those big companies to do what they know they should be doing, particularly in the telecoms, electronic and electrical sectors, where the big players, I won't bother to name the really outstandingly bad performers in these sectors, big players still design new products to drive redundancy, to drive the short lifespans for a phone, for a computer, whatever it might be, and make it practically impossible for the repair, reuse, disassembly and repurposing agenda to be worked through. So no amount of individual pressure from an individual consumer can ever change that. It's only governments coming together to say, this is outrageous. This is just totally exploitative of consumers and of the environment. So as of whenever, set the date, you are going to have to design with these minimum conditions built in.
Yeah, so that's in terms of purchasing power and consumers. I mean, there's also civil disobedience. And if you look at Extinction Rebellion, and only 2 weeks ago, they were saying, don't repay your mortgages, don't repay your loans. So putting pressure on financial institutions. I mean, there is a form of power there, if you will.
There is. I think that's going to be hard for people. There are significant implications in failing to follow through on contractual agreements. Let's start with a different place here and remember the power of banks in our lives. European banks are still significant investors in the fossil fuel economy, in sectors and businesses that are essentially destroying the prospects for humankind's sustainable future. So the first thing you can do if you want to flex your muscles on the finance side is make sure you're banking with a bank that actually cares about the future of humankind, rather than a bank that is profiting at your expense and the expense of all future generations. That is a big decision. People are very slow to do the obvious things. Change your bank. Check your pension schemes. Are your pensions being invested on your behalf in such a way that they're going to give you the returns that you expect, but also are not going to go on trashing the planet? Are you sure there aren't any fossil fuel companies in your own personal pension pot? Sorry, I'm just assuming that those involved in this call might have a pension pot, hopefully. In which case, check it out. Do the obvious stuff. It doesn't mean to say you have to become criminal by refusing to pay your bills. There's tons of stuff you can do before you get to the point where you need to take extreme measures of that kind.
Another question here, should consumers be using their political power rather than their spending power? Well, I suppose
both.
That's what consumers do.
Both.
Yeah.
I remember actually, I was just thinking about this in answer to a question you asked me before, Anya, and it reminded me that when Al Gore, former Vice President Al Gore, was very involved in his climate advocacy and was kind of going around the world with his inconvenient truth, the first one really to flag up the existential risk in accelerating climate change, he had an incredibly simple way of telling people or advising people what they could do, and I thought it was really well explained. He just put it into three categories: choice, voice, and vote. So choice as in every purchasing decision you make, whether it's your pension provider, your phone provider, the food you're buying. So choice being top of your agenda when you're thinking about sustainability. Voice as in speak up. So I would say to everybody on a call like this, do you really know what is at the heart of this climate emergency? I know it sounds obvious, but actually you have to dig down a bit. Don't just take it on trust that what people are saying, the scientists are saying out there, has given you a sort of reason not to do your own research. Do some research, and when you've done your research, raise your voice. I guarantee you'll be working with an awful lot of people in your companies who will be less open to the kind of things we're talking about here than participants in this call might be. By virtue of being on this call, you pretty much kind of said, I want to be a party to the change process that is going on here. And I know as I say these words, coming into your mind will be the image of colleagues back in your workplace who would not understand why you're on this call. So think about voice. How are you going to go after those who still, for some reason, think this stuff isn't top of the list? And then finally, vote. So coming back to your question about politics, I'm not talking party politics. Vote was a kind of shorthand for let's understand it all eventually comes down to the political decisions that we make. So choice, voice, and vote.
Very good tip there, Jonathan. We've got a couple of minutes left. So I'm just going to sort of wrap up really and ask you for a couple of final thoughts. How optimistic are you that we're going to turn things around this decade? And also, I suppose I'm going to be interviewing Stefan Moser next. So would you have a message or a question for him?
I'm not optimistic. I know that's not a good way to start my answer, because I don't think we need either bags of optimism or bags of pessimism. Optimism is too often dependent on shiny solutions that aren't going to make a difference, and pessimism drives too much disempowerment and people just opting out. So when people ask me this, I say I am full of hope. I believe that we can still do this. I know we've still got time to do this, by the way. I spent a lot of time looking at whether we've still got the number of years required to avoid runaway climate change. And I am with the mainstream scientific consensus on that we have. But it is one hell of a challenge that we face. So I'm hopeful about that. One of the things that makes me hopeful is because I know there are an awful lot of people now who understand that wealth creation and our understanding of wealth creation has to change pretty profoundly in order to make that happen. So for me, those things are definitely top of my list as I look at the reasons to be hopeful story. But obviously, there are plenty of counterfactuals that might persuade you that we're not quite in the right position that we need to be at the moment. That's what I'm still, 45 years on, intent on changing if I possibly can.
Good for you. And do you have a message for Stefan Moser as he takes on his huge project?
You're absolutely right. And I've already said how important I think Stefan Moser's role is. I absolutely take my hat off to the people who have driven this agenda of energy efficiency across Europe, often thanklessly. Let's be realistic about this, often in the teeth of really powerful vested interests in different sectors who've tried to ward off the regulatory powers of the EU to enable them to go on profiting at everybody else's expense. So my question to him is, I guess, or my contribution to that discussion with him is, does he feel more confident now that the current configuration of the EU, with a new commission, a new president, a new parliament, and lots of new commissioners, that looks better from the perspective of what needs to happen in the next decade? It does to me, but I'm an outsider from the internal workings of the EU. And I just hope he's feeling that this new sense of purpose in the architecture of the EU will start delivering this stuff faster than I'm sure he would have wanted in the past.
Jonathon Porrit, thank you very much. That was really enjoyable and fantastic for me to be able to talk to you for so long. And I'm sure everyone really enjoyed and took heart at what you had to say. Thank you so much.
I much enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
I think we're off air now. Thank you very much, Jonathon. That was great. I'm not sure if I can still hear you.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming back. I hope you managed to grab a quick cup of coffee while we had a break, and we're going to go on to our second keynote interview now. I'm very pleased to welcome Stefan Moser, who's the head of Unit Energy Efficiency Buildings and Products at the European Commission. We're going to be talking a bit further about some of the issues raised by Jonathon Porrit earlier, and also in particular about the new Renovation Wave. And a quick reminder that you can all send your questions in too. It's not just me who gets to ask all the questions this time. So welcome, Mr. Moser. Thank you very much for joining us. So the Renovation Wave, I want to talk to you about that in particular because it's one of the key priorities of the Green Deal. And it's described in the communication, in the Commission's official communication, as a win-win for climate neutrality and recovery. It'll protect biodiversity by reducing greenfield construction and create thousands of jobs. And it has a goal to renovate 35 million building units by 2030. So there's a lot riding on this renovation wave, isn't there?
So thank you very much, Anya, for kindly inviting me to this very interesting session. Indeed, from our point of view, it's a win-win, in particular, as we need to do a tremendous step forward on renovations anyway. So even if the health crisis had not occurred at the same time, but now we have also the additional challenge of making sure that many citizens will find new jobs, new employment possibilities, and also to address affordability, energy poverty at the same time. And there's significant funds made available through tremendous efforts in Europe, but also around the world. And the important thing is now to see how actually people can be helped out of the crisis. And we see that the construction and renovation sector is one of the sectors where people will find, if they may have lost or reduced employment opportunities elsewhere, may have another chance to reorient themselves and learn new skills and get into that, really, because we need a tremendous increase in activity in the sector, both from the production side, but also advisory services, and of course also people who do both very I would say technical work, partly manual work, but also highly artistic and design work even. So when it comes, for instance, to thinking about how aesthetics can be improved in the future while actually making sure that buildings are energy efficient, much more energy efficient, healthy, greener, nicer to live in, and also affordable at the same time, because that's a very important objective, to make sure that affordability will be preserved.
It sounds like quite a utopian view, quite a vision for the future, really.
I think this is what indeed the Commission is trying to do with the new European Bauhaus concept, to bring together people from all walks of life to think about how we live in the future by addressing the important challenges which we have on the energy side, making sure that we really reduce energy consumption, but at the same time also greenhouse gas emissions from buildings, making buildings an active part of society, but also of the energy system more in particular, and linking them to other sectors such as transport, making sure that they can produce and renewable energy in the building, but also consume renewable energy locally produced, which is locally produced, and have also a very active demand response, that they can adjust their energy behavior, both producing and consuming, through informed choices of the people living inside. So this is really what we need to ensure. And of course, we will only achieve that if we do that together with the citizens, with the actors which are responsible locally, in the cities. It ranges from the architects to the engineers, to designers, but also the local planning authorities, and of course the citizens, that they have a chance to really express themselves, what they want to have in terms of other objectives being reached. Yeah? So it's not just about energy, it's about accessibility, making sure that buildings are nicely integrated in the urban environment, that the urban environment is at the same time improved. And that, as you said already in your introduction, Anya, that we really try to improve the built environment as we have it, and don't just abandon parts of cities and build new things out there in the green fields. And then in parts of the world, this actually has happened, that you have abandoned inner cities and rather you always construct new things outside. We certainly don't only have a kind of inward-looking approach in Europe. We would like to engage with international partners. Of course, it's a local issue. It's even, I would say, very much for the regional and city actors, but really share experiences across the world between these actors, and make sure that good practices are taken up and that we learn from each other what works and what doesn't work.
Right, thank you. So talking about renovating buildings in the city, existing building stock. So I think something like only 11% of buildings in Europe are renovated each year. And in fact, in terms of energy renovation, it's only about 1%. And that's a very difficult thing to do, isn't it? Because many of these homes, for instance, are still using gas. I mean, how are you going to do this?
Well, there are various challenges which have to be addressed simultaneously. One is really to make sure that when a renovation is done anyway, that you use the full potential of it, that you think broadly, that you achieve a deep renovation, basically, that you really think about the options, don't just have easy solutions, which may have just been a local practice for some time and people just replicate it, but really think deeply. And there, of course, learn from good practices elsewhere. And the other challenge is to increase the rate, that basically people think more actively and are ready to engage in a renovation, which otherwise they may not have done, simply by using incentives which are provided and by putting that higher up on their own priority list, that basically they think responsibly. And of course, this has usually to be accompanied by both financing incentives, which have to partly come from public money and partly from private money, and then also technical advice, because it's not just a financing gap, it's also the knowledge gap, and often basically just the challenge, I've never done that, how does it work, I don't know, that basically people would get at least easy access to information. That's the idea of one-stop shops, really. And to thinking notably also in district terms, neighborhoods, that basically you would address similar buildings, for instance, at the same time, and also develop then more affordable, cheaper solutions for them, because you may think of neighborhoods where many houses have been built or were built at the same time, more or less, have very similar features. So there could be a kind of standard approach in terms of technical solutions, not necessarily aesthetic looks, but could then lead to a situation that it becomes much more affordable, that you don't have to put all the brains into one single house, but rather a whole neighborhood and divide the costs up across many people, basically. Huh? So that's the idea also. And to have basically a citizen movement really in that respect, that you don't just think about the houses, but also see what else can be improved. For instance, the cabling, if necessary, the digital side, and then very important, accessibility. I mean, accessibility has been an issue of growing concern. It's extremely important, of course, for disabled people in any case, but also many senior citizens who are simply not anymore that much in a position to walk up all these stairs and have tiny staircases, to really think about that. In several member states, also across the world, of course, more broadly, renovations can also be used to improve really the safety of a house, seismic safety, to make sure to have a look basically at the stability of the house, but also fire safety. So to see what materials were used, and then health hazards which are in the building, when you do a renovation, you have to think about that to protect the workers, but also see that basically hazardous materials such as asbestos or radon-emitting substances can be eliminated to improve indoor air quality. Yeah.
So a huge task ahead there. What does it mean for many of the people watching here who are part of the listed real estate industry? Where do they fit in? What role can they play in all of this?
I think the housing companies, listed or not, but even house owners more broadly, have a huge chance and responsibility at the same time, because they will be one of the key drivers. They are the owners. They're basically able to change, and if they decide for it, it will. There's a very high likelihood that it will be successful, happen. And if they decide against, it will not happen at all, because they can block it to a large degree. And that's why it's so important to see this an opportunity in the interest of both the investors, but also the users. And I think the regulatory push, and I see a question there in the chat, will have to come alongside together with the financial and technical assistance being provided, because we need a clear direction, incentives created for all actors, and this is what actually we are trying to do with legislation also in the EU, to build on good practices in the member states, which have introduced already minimum energy performance standards, for instance. We see that very much as an issue requiring attention, to the extent that we need to, on the one hand, have a push in the same direction to make sure that we get to the targets which we need to achieve for the Green Deal, but also allow for flexibility for member states and have really a realistic and fair transition. There cannot be basically a kind of uniform obligation for everyone in the EU. The reality is simply too different. And also internationally, of course, when we learn from each other, that could be actually a useful experience to see really what works where and how, and what buildings exactly would have to be targeted, what should be the standards, and what would be a reasonable transition in terms of timing also.
So just to answer that question that's just come in on the chat there, so will there be any regulatory push from the EU side, or should it be something up to member states?
This is what we announced in the Renovation Wave, indeed. So some member states have already taken action. We think that this should be replicated across the EU, but what we still need to think about how to do it precisely, how to design these minimum energy performance standards. And that will be part of the revision of the Energy Performance in Buildings Directive. There will also be other legislation opened up next year to basically recalibrate the EU legal framework to the increased ambition of the Green Deal. We have quite a performing legislative framework, but it's not calibrated to the increased ambition of 55% by 2030. It's still on the 40% or a bit more than 40% in reality of the previous political framework for 2030 and legal framework, of course. So what we also need to think about is improvements to energy performance certificates and audits, but also how to improve the situation on the heating and cooling side, notably to increase the share of renewable energy there. As you mentioned, Anya, a lot of buildings are still reliant on fossil fuels. Many of them are highly polluting, notably coal. And some other fossil fuels are already less polluting. There are many good technologies. There will always be some role for fossil fuels, but what we try to do is really to move towards the most advanced solutions in one go. But we do recognize that it will not be possible everywhere. But what we indeed would like to push for is at least decarbonized solutions, or very low carbon decarbonized solutions, even if it's gas. There will always be a role for gas, but the installations newly created should be fit for biogas and possibly other forms of gas, and certainly decarbonized forms of gas for the midterm. In the short term, of course, natural gas will still be used largely. That's also clear. So there we are, of course, understanding that certain things cannot happen overnight.
So I just wanted to ask another question, quite a long question. I shall read it out. This is about the EU taxonomy. So what concerns real estate sector? It seems that under acquisition and ownership, the entire focus is on acquisitions of new buildings. And in fact, the criteria refers to buildings with energy performance certificate class A, which corresponds to a very small share of European building stock. So is this approach misaligned to the objectives of the other EU initiatives, such as the Renovation Wave? So what they really want to do is address climate change, then we should instead be encouraging acquiring existing buildings to renovate, as that's a true transitional activity, which could substantially contribute to the climate change mitigation. Will the Commission make sure that the EU taxonomy aligns with the Renovation Wave?
I think that is certainly our objective, to have a mutual reinforcement. The objective is really to bring in public and private money to the largest possible degree to push forward improvements in the renovation sector. And the taxonomy is one instrument, of course, to orientate investments. But with the multi-annual financial framework and the recovery funds, the effort is now really to make sure that member states will develop a very high absorption capacity, very high quality absorption capacity for using the available amounts of public money, in this case, in the most useful manner, and then also stimulate and put that together with private investments. There will be a very important role for the promotional banks, both at the EU level, the EIB, also the EBRD, which is partly outside the EU framework, but cooperating very closely with us, and the national promotional banks, and each member state, to make sure that there's an operational framework for that money to arrive really with the citizens, with the local actors. This is usually done in a national context, and that I think will be very important then for member states to explain who exactly is responsible, how do you get access to the money, and how do you combine it also with the technical knowledge needed to execute, to perform a renovation from the beginning to the end. Often it's these practical things: who do I need to talk to, where do I get the money, what are the criteria for me, so that this is not a kind of bureaucratic nightmare for people that they start reading it and give up after 5 minutes, but it should be done in a very user-friendly manner, basically. And of course, that's also the role for state aid, for national state aid, and that links then with the revision of the state aid guidelines, which is ongoing, where the Renovation Wave will be reflected, I think, in terms of policy objectives. The question is now how to do it precisely. Our colleagues in DG Competition in the Commission are now thinking about that, how to basically best recalibrate the wording on energy efficiency, but also on renewables more broadly, to make that really in line with the Green Deal objectives.
There's another question that's come in, because you do make it sound like there's a lot to do, and someone has actually said there's a lot of work to do. Are we going to actually ever get it done?
Well, that is our hope. I mean, we are certainly not alone. We are not doing it from Brussels alone. I think it's a collective enterprise challenge for the EU level, the member states, but not only at central government level, but if I say member states, it means also the regional, local authorities, and then the investors, the owners of buildings, but also citizens, that they do recognize renovations as something desirable, that they basically would welcome a renovation as something which can improve, even if it creates short-term inconveniences, because no one likes to have a construction site at home. So that this is seen as, of course, as an inconvenience, but largely compensated and overcompensated by the advantages. Once you're through it, you have much better quality. It's not just about saving energy, it's simply making your building better to live in. And I think that will then create also public acceptance, but we would even say there should be enthusiasm really from people. I think that's the idea of the Bauhaus, to have some positive energy being created with something which is more more human than the purely rational, I would say. The excitement about new aesthetics and thinking about how we live, what else needs to be improved in the buildings, but also around the buildings, because there can be these kind of mutual synergies. Once you go into opening up a building by renovation, you can do several things at the same time. Yeah, so it's linking to your cars, to the parkings, not just having access to electricity to recharge your cars and bikes, but also possibly more bike parking and broader entrances, and, as I said before, accessibility and all that. But of course, this may partly sound utopian, and I think there we have to be careful. What we need to make sure is that this is accompanied by a sense of realism in terms of how much does it cost, and especially also how increases in living costs will be mitigated. So that's what member states, through their broader social policies, need to think about, how to buffer at least the impact on people who would not be able to afford anymore an apartment or a house after renovation. So that, I think, needs to be partly buffered by public money, I would say, but also by a smart design of the interaction between the owners and those people renting, for instance.
Okay, so very quickly, just on the back of that Bauhaus idea, would that be new build then, or could you transform existing buildings into that kind of Bauhaus concept? I
think the Bauhaus concept is really covering the whole ground, new and renovations. What we are now trying to do in the Commission, this will be led by the Joint Research Center in cooperation with the policy DGs, including DG Energy, is to really collect ideas, how to do that, what needs to be addressed, and then in the implementation phase later on, to have also a geographical diversification. So not just have basically one European Bauhaus, one for everybody, but rather regional concepts also, and allowing for regional diversity, and even encouraging that, because we do have, of course, a multicultural continent in terms of traditions, needs also, climate needs, either hot or very cold climate or moderate climate, and simply the local tastes are different. So, and I think solutions will have to be adapted to that to be successful. Otherwise, it would not work. And it cannot just be a functional approach. It has to be the functional, saving energy, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, making buildings and homes smart and interactive with the rest of the energy and transport system, for instance, but also making sure that they do look then nice and attractive to live in, and greener also.
So you talked earlier about introducing more regulations, I think, just to make it the achievement to meet the goals of meeting those climate targets more realistic and possible. I just wanted to look from the point of view of investors and ESG. Will that have to change? Will those standards have to change?
Well, the regulations will be improved. I would say there will not be a new regulation or directive which will be introduced, but rather the existing ones will be looked at again, and we will see what actually will be necessary to overcome the barriers which would stand in the way of getting to the increased climate ambition for 2030, the 55%, because as said previously, the current framework is not calibrated to that. It was made for something else. It was made for a 40% climate target for 2030, and but the instruments which we have should remain, and they are fully valid, need to be implemented. We have to build on top of them, or not on top, but within them, to improve them, make them a bit more performing in that respect. And that's why we need to look at, for instance, the energy performance certificates, the audits, how to make them more useful. And in particular, that's a new item indeed, the minimum energy performance standards, which don't exist yet, which in the last revision were kept out. Yeah? There was, of course, thinking about that. It was on the radar screen, but it was decided against at the time. Of course, in Europe, you have always the delicate balance to strike between the national energy autonomy and sovereignty. One can say that member states are responsible for their territory. It's subsidiarity, and what basically would have to be really regulated at the EU level. And I think that's balance always has to be relooked again and rethought, notably when it comes to increasing collective efforts. And here we think that there's now a stronger case than in the past to go for this cross European minimum energy performance standards, but in a kind of, I would say, smart manner. So not leaving some flexibility, and think also about a realistic time schedule for introduction.
So we've got a couple of minutes left, and there's a lot to do. So what's the next step? Do member states have to come up with something next? What happens next?
I think the next steps are on the one side on finance, on using the recovery funds. Notably, that's the most urgent. You have the multi-annual financial framework, which I would say is more the traditional policy, spending policy instruments, the cohesion policy instruments, regional policy, etc. Now we have also the Just Transition Fund, but more time pressed is basically using the money made available for recovery. So member states are sending in and developing recovery plans, which should be based on the substantive policies being fully prepared for absorbing that kind of money and that additional amount of money. For renovation, that's the long-term renovation strategy. So member states are finalizing. We have a bit more than half of the member states already in, with some very good ones, really. So that shows that there can be a very high quality, but some other member states still need to do that. And we are encouraging them to do that very quickly, and then develop high quality recovery plans, which will be the basis for taking up the money made available for recovery. On the legislative side, we'll have to now do the impact assessments. That includes also public consultations on all these legislative revisions, developing options, asking stakeholders such as yourselves, the owners, the real estate owners, and all others, what they think about them, what are the pros and cons, really. And on that basis, we would then develop our proposal, which would come out in the course of next year. So there will be one package which currently is announced for mid next year, which will include the European emissions trading scheme, but also the renewable energy and the energy efficiency directives, and then the energy performance in buildings directive by the end of next year. So, and that's basically will have to be harmoniously constructed. And there will be some other improvements, revisions, some of them in the form of guidance, like green public procurement. That's very important for public buildings, for schools, hospitals, how to carry out renovations and to really think about the public building stock very deeply as well. And then basically a number of other initiatives to improve the performance of the internal market, of the construction industry, but also on the affordable side, affordable housing strategy will be developed as well, and some initiatives linked to upskilling and reskilling of workers in cooperation with the social partners. That's extremely important to firstly create opportunities for people who may have lost their or may have reduced employment opportunities in the sectors where they've worked previously, and to increase the capacity of the building sector.
A lot to do then. You're going to be very busy for the next few years, I think, Stefan Moser. Thank you so much for taking part in today's event. I think the audience would have found that very enlightening and useful, hopefully. So thank you once again. And to the audience, you've got 10 minutes or so, and at 10 past, no, sorry, we've got coming up at 10 past 2, apologies, we have the panel discussion. So don't go away. See you soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anya. Very kind of you. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Okay, so I think we're all here. Good afternoon from Switzerland. I have the honor to moderate this first panel discussion. As we heard in the previous keynote interviews, climate change is a material issue for real estate companies from a double materiality perspective, and this may present risks as well as opportunities that can have a considerable impact on the bottom line. So clearly, this is a key issue that investors must consider if they have a long-term view, irrespective of whether they are particularly sustainability oriented or not. And these days, if you listen to the institutional investors, they are all sustainability oriented. But are they walking the talk? Or could investors do more to accelerate this transition towards low carbon and net zero carbon in real estate, or let's say in listed real estate? So this is what we want to talk about now. I welcome here on the panel Louise Ellison, who is Group Head of Sustainability at Hammerson and also Chairwoman of the Epra Sustainability Committee and Chair of the Better Buildings Partnership. Then we have Olivier Lamine, CEO of Alstria and also member of the Epra Sustainability Committee, as well as Chair of the Epra Reporting and Accounting Committee. Then on the representing the investor side, we have Jan-Willem van Kranenburg, Senior Lead Analyst at Cohen & Steers. Cohen & Steers is a leading global investment manager specializing in real assets and alternative income. And last but not least, Etienne Cadesta, founder and global CEO of Longevity Partners. Longevity is an expert sustainability advisor to the real estate market, advising some of the largest property investment companies in Europe. So you're kind of in between the investors and the real estate companies. The whole session is about 45 minutes. So I would say after 30 to 35 minutes, we can open it up to questions from the audience. But since you're all in front of your computer, please just type in your questions in your chat, and then we can take it up in the end or build them in if it fits. So I would like to start with the cost of CO2 reduction investments. Real estate companies have already done a lot to reduce energy use and CO2 emissions of their properties, or at least the proactive companies have already picked the low-hanging fruit, and anything that makes good business sense will be done anyway in the framework of their retrofitting plans. But somehow this doesn't seem to be enough to get us on this trajectory of the 1.5 degree commitment. So real estate companies may have to go beyond their usual renovation plan, and some of those investments may not look so attractive from a purely financial point of view. So considering asset owners are always confronted with a split incentive problems, and there is still so much uncertainty about if and when and how externalities of CO2 emissions will be properly internalized, i.e. priced. It's not so easy for listed real estate companies to justify towards their shareholders that with these investments, they are not destroying value here, driving down margins, but actually making prudent decisions for the future that will add value for the tenants and also increase asset value. So let's start with all of you, because you seem to have asked yourself that question too, and you have tried an approach to deal with this at your last AGM. And it would be great if you could explain in a few sentences what your proposal was, because I find this is a really interesting case study.
Thank you very much, Agathe. So what we did at our last AGM is we suggested to our shareholder to withhold 1 cent of dividends in order to fund for a number of projects that would reduce the CO2 footprint of the company, but which on a standalone basis would not go through our underwriting and hurt the returns expectation as a company. But before I describe this in a bit more detail, I just want to say 2 things. I mean, the first thing is the reason why we're having this conversation is because despite everything we heard over the last 30 minutes, government and they're just not doing their job. The easy way to sort it out is to have a carbon tax, which is accordingly priced, and then we don't have to discuss whether it makes sense economically or not. So I think that's the first thing which is important to highlight. We don't need them to put together taxonomy. We don't need them to explain to us what's efficient and what's not efficient. I mean, the only thing we're asking them to do, and by the way, it's not new. It's here since 1920, was introduced by a guy called Etienne Pigou in 1920. So it's not a new idea here that the carbon tax would kind of save the day here. So I wanted to say that as a starting point. And the second thing is, I don't think it's not a shareholder against company. It's basically shareholder and companies. I mean, shareholder are basically the owner of the companies, and we are managing the companies. And at the end of the day, it's about having a dialogue between shareholders and company, and what do we want to do and how we want to do it. And we came to the conclusion, as you rightly introduced, that everything that we can do that is generating profit, we're doing already. And if at the same time it can help to reach the 1.5 degree target, of course we're going to be doing it, and we don't need to sit down and discuss it. But this is not getting us there. It is just not getting us there at all. If you look at how CO2 is evolving in the atmosphere, I mean, it's like a straight line, and it's going up and up every year. So at one stage, we need to realize that if government do not introduce a tax, which would be a cost to the company, and if we want to take and deal with the problem ourselves, then we need to agree that we're going to create a private tax, and there's going to be a cost to move from a carbonized economy to a decarbonized economy. And this is really the question we're trying to address with the green dividend. We're basically telling our shareholders, how much do you think we should be investing outside of the financial norm, and how much return are you prepared to sacrifice in order to get it there? I mean, the vast majority of our shareholders have voted to get the dividend paid out, which doesn't mean that they don't care. It just means that they have decided to take the money. And we intend to ask the question every other year, because I think it's not something which you ask the question once, you ask it, I think, on a regular basis. People can say their view. And so I think it's important that we have this dialogue collectively, and that we have an understanding about what we want to do and where we want to do. Because as soon as a company, as a management, you decide to invest outside of financial norms, there's literally no limit at how much you can invest. I mean, you can invest $1 million, you can invest 20 million, you can invest 100 million, and some companies are actually investing hundreds of millions in order to try to solve the problem. But there is literally no limit to what you can do. So the question is, I think it's an important dialogue that we need to have. We need to clarify the mandate that shareholders are giving to companies when it comes to addressing climate change, and that dialogue needs to take place.
Yeah. So I mean, 95.1% of us, the shareholders, said we want the dividend to be paid out. We want more money. If I may quote your press release, you said, I mean, this is a clear mandate. I quote, Austria shall not weaken its return expectations solely based on better climate change expectations. Mm-hmm. Now, Jan Willem, on the Cohen and Steers website, where you explain your ESG approach, I can read, among other, I also quote, our proxy voting decisions take ESG factors into consideration and seek to protect our clients' long-term economic interests. Now, you're also a shareholder in Austria in at least 2 funds. So, I mean, I don't know what you voted, but I can take a guess. So I was just wondering, what were your considerations in this specific case?
Unfortunately, we're not really, sometimes we don't just say how we vote in specific circumstances. What I can say is like that the duration of our capital is long term, right? So we have a permanent presence in the space. The structure of REITs is also that their capital base is of a permanent one. So if all things go well, we'll be here still in 15 years time, 20 years time, and we know that the portfolios that we invest in will look very different 10 to 20 to 30 years from now on, right? So I think we should support companies on that journey. Our primary goal is to maximize returns and outperform the benchmark. Having said that, it's not only about short-term shareholder gains, and all stakeholders need to be considered. And I think today it's about striking that fine balance between today and tomorrow, right? And I think as regulation changes or is introduced, carbon taxes are introduced and financial incentives changed, change, the rules of the games are turned upside down. And I think we look for management teams that have competencies that are able to respond properly to those rules, and portfolios that already are well situated to respond to those rules correctly.
So, I mean, Louise, like, is there really, I mean, how did you perceive this? Is there really a trade-off, or is it just a question of time horizon? Was it maybe the wrong question, or not considering the future added value appropriately?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a challenge, isn't it? Short term, long term, and we've been grappling with it for a long time. If you are a long-term investor in assets, and a company like Hammerson we tend to be long-term in the assets that we hold. It's an actively traded portfolio, but it's when we move into cities, we tend to be there for a fairly long time. So will have a different perspective in terms of the amount you're going to be able and willing to invest in an asset in order to improve it. And I think from a shareholder perspective, yeah, and Willem's been talking about the fact that, you know, they're a long hold investors, so they will have a perspective that wants to look at how these assets are going to perform over a particular period of time. If you are constantly having to look at the next quarter, the next 12 months, the next 3 years, it makes it very difficult to invest. But at any point in time when my C-suite are having conversations with the investors, there is still that conflict between, well, you know, you need to reduce your operating costs. Well, yeah, okay, but we also need to be investing in the assets. So which do you want? Because we are going to have to spend money if we're going to get the assets to perform in the way that they need to. So it's an active dialogue, and yeah, it needs to be a conversation that you have with your investors, and we need to have more of it. And I think it's one of the really helpful and valuable things of what Olivier has done is to start that conversation and make it a little bit more interesting. It's taking it to the next level, because you can't just constantly be sort of expecting, you know, you've got to give us the returns, and at the same time you need to be making sure that you're getting these assets to the sort of targets that we're setting out. You look at something like the CREM targets, getting any portfolio to achieve those targets by, you know, 2050, let alone 2030, is going to require inordinate amounts of money. And even if you can, so what does that say about the assets? And you also we need to start thinking about whether or not this is the right place to be spending that capital in terms of just the physics of getting carbon emissions out of the atmosphere, because we need to kind of step back a bit and look at whether or not we're really doing the right thing. Because yeah, we do need to make this a long-term conversation and be thinking about the long-term returns, but there's more to it than simply whether or not you invest in the next round of LED lighting.
Mm-hmm. So Etienne, how do you consult your clients in the real estate side to deal with this issue, like how to help them prioritize CO2 reduction projects and how to sell it to the investors so that they believe they are value adding?
Yeah, so first of all, Agathe, thanks so much for inviting me to take part in this webinar. I'm really pleased to be here amongst you and be part of the discussion. Look, we work in 38 different countries across all asset types in the real estate sector for all kinds of real estate investors or occupiers. So the strategies are very different based on the investor type and the asset type, but also the geographical location, because the challenges are different. But the first thing that I'm telling my clients is to be aware of the risks associated with climate change. And we all know that a 4 degrees world is not insurable. We know that it costs a lot of money. You know, just in a few years ago, 3 storms within 2 months in the US, Irma, Harvey, and Maria, wiped out $280 billion of value within the space of 2 months. So, you know, it is real, it is tangible, and something needs to happen. We also know that it's going to get worse and worse. So as an industry, you know, representing nearly 40% of global carbon emissions, there is a collective responsibility associated with reducing carbon emissions. Now, you know, a lot of my clients just don't know. Some of them know what to do, some of them don't know what to do, and they need help in order to find the right path. And it requires asking, you know, the right question. You know, what does it mean to be responsible for your business? Where do you want to go? And we do a lot of strategy work at the moment to try and define what roadmap our clients are going to take. But, you know, the solutions are there. You know, there's tons of solutions. There's, you know, net zero carbon can be done, you know, through spending a lot of money. It can be done through, you know, storage, production, and obviously reduction of carbon emissions through energy efficiency. And we will always push our clients to have a better understanding of their real estate. And there's still too many asset managers out there who do not have a good understanding of you know, the kit that they've got and the potential for carbon emission reduction. A lot of them have, you know, bridged that gap a while ago, looking at energy efficiency. You know, you mentioned, Louise, you know, the next batch of LED lighting, and these, you know, would assume that a lot of organizations would have done it beforehand, but sometimes, you know, you'd be surprised. So, you know, we try to deploy systemic change throughout, one, having a very good understanding of their portfolios, and that can be done through certification. Certification is important because it is verified and accredited by a third party. It's not enough today to say, I'm the best. It's like, well, you know, if you think you're the best, maybe it needs to be verified by somebody, and then you can claim that you're the best. So we do a lot of certifications. We've got about 120 billion of assets under certification management. And then we always raise the bar. Now, I do think that there's a huge lack of best practice in the industry. You know, we've got GRESB. Yeah, right. I mean, GRESB is great, but the data is not verified. So, I mean, what does it make of, you know, the entire system? We need more best practice around climate risk as well. You know, we've got tools, yes, okay, but it doesn't really tell you about, you know, what is the best practice in terms of value at risk. And that's what investors want to know. What is the amount of value that is at risk in my portfolio? And I don't think there's any tools out there that is, you know, best practice. Also based on local data, you know, because a lot of models that are being developed are based on, you know, not very specific data on climate risk. And we know that, you know, climate, you know, it's a very localized science, and a lot more needs to be done on that. And then last but not least, I always tell to my clients and property investors that property is about people. You know, it's about training, it's about dialogue, it's about collaboration, like Olivier said. And I do think that you get more results by a bottom-up approach, whereby you will empower local teams to actually drive and deliver efficiency through good processes implemented throughout portfolios.
So
I think it's a good point that there is a big range out there in terms of there are a lot of portfolios which won't have done a huge amount and really need to start doing more. So there is a big tail of companies and portfolios that need to be brought along and need to understand what needs to be delivered. But it kind of goes back to Olivier's point and what Jonathon Porrit was talking about earlier in terms of level playing field and carbon taxing, because that is going to be the simplest way of making something happen.
Because if I rebound on what Etienne said, and this is a risk manager's approach. I mean, when you have a risk, there is two ways to deal with it. Either you can mitigate the risk, or you can mitigate the consequence of the risk happening. If I look at climate change individually as a company, I cannot mitigate the risk. I need everybody to be asking and rowing in the same direction for that risk to be mitigated. And currently, without the help of government, we're probably not going to get there. And therefore, I need to come, any pure risk analysis will get you to the conclusion that you should not be trying to mitigate the risk. You should try to mitigate the consequence of the risk, which means that I should not be spending capital into trying to reduce CO2, but I should be spending capital to try to reduce the consequence of CO2 reaching the level that they will reach. I mean, basically selling coastal properties, making sure I mean, you can be able to resist the climate migration that's going to happen. I don't even know whether we can handle that risk, but this is where we should be spending our money. And I think that's the that's a balance that you need to make currently as a management. And that's the conversation we also need to have with our shareholder. If there is no global, if we're not all rowing in the same direction, then there's no point in one of us rowing in that direction. You'd better try to mitigate the consequence of the risk itself. And I think this is maybe a message also we need to get across to the politics, is that, at one stage, we're going to stop trying to mitigate climate change itself, but we need to start worrying about its consequences.
It does present some very interesting questions for Jan Willem's community, because suddenly, are you going to be able to just invest in real estate that is not exposed to any, nothing on a coast? That puts some quite expensive real estate in California out of the question.
It will help.
I suppose it is about mitigation and adaptation at the same time. I just, in the interest of time, I also looking at the some of the questions in the chat. I wanted to address some of the policy drivers, which should also help increase awareness among clients and help institutional investors channel more money towards investments in CO2 reduction or adaptation, if you wish. But a good excuse for not investing sustainably by institutional investors, as well as the end clients, has always been that there's too much greenwashing. It's not enough, not clear definition of what is sustainable. It's not comparable. So the EU taxonomy was created to address this issue to some extent. And everybody's talking about this taxonomy. And it seems to be like there's this massive expectation that once it's transparent, what is sustainable and what is not sustainable, the money is just going to flow towards more sustainable investments in carbon reduction. But having seen also the current proposal by the European Commission for the technical screening criteria for real estate yesterday, I couldn't help thinking that the approach is a little bit flawed or even counterproductive to some extent, if the ultimate goal is really to reduce CO2 emissions of the building stock. I mean, that's only with respect to real estate. I can't speak for the other sectors. But so specifically relating to real estate, I mean, is this taxonomy going to be an important catalyst to help deliver the Green Deal, or is it just going to make our world more complicated and create more paperwork? I mean, Olivier kind of already gave the answer, but Louise, what do you think? Is this going to help you position Hammerson as a proactive company?
I think it might make us want to invest in paper companies. The amount of paper that's going to be driven by this document is very, very frustrating. And the people who sit around the Sustainability Committee for Epra and the other committees and things that I belong to and work with spend a lot of time looking at consultations and legislation and regulation, and become increasingly frustrated with the fact that there's a lack of clarity and a lack of real kind of oversight, I suppose, vision about what really needs to be done, because we can keep rearranging the deck chairs, but unless there is a really kind of clear sense from the top of these organizations that it's not about how you define it, it's about what you do and about what you stop businesses doing and what you enable other businesses and enable economies to get behind and to invest in. Because unless you do that, then however many you can invent all the taxonomies you like, and you can divide you can divide up and look at our sector in 100 different ways, it won't help. Nothing will help. You have to find a way of simply getting the capital to the right place. And the businesses, we're good at doing that. If you set the ground rules, we are pretty good at working out how to actually make money out of it and send capital in the right directions, in my view.
So, Jan Willem, is the taxonomy going to help you to attract client money and move the money in the right direction?
To be honest, I doubt it. I doubt it. It may accelerate a little bit more the whole process that have been already in place, but it's pretty vague. And at this point, you're just going to see more ESG funds, and those funds, because it's what people want nowadays, and those funds will look into buying green companies, and it's very marketing driven. I mean, we have to separate marketing from facts, and labeling is good, but it's not about labeling, right? I mean, I think labeling helps us to identify which companies have labels. And so and ultimately it should be about doing things differently. And so I doubt if it really counts to make a big difference.
Mm-hmm. Well, Etienne, I suppose it's good business for you, not trying to help the companies trying to find out what this means for their positioning.
Figuring out what the taxonomy is was already a task in itself. I think it's a huge display of European soft power, having very very open rules that is very much open to interpretation. It's not what we need as an industry. As an industry, we need very clear targets, very clear cost of carbon would be great. We talk about carbon tax, level playing field would be incredible. And I think there are a lot of companies that have already anticipated that will be in a much better position, comes 2025, 2026, which is when I think carbon taxation will start, being considered very seriously. We've got 10 years to solve that climate crisis, to avoid, irreversible climate tipping points. And what we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years is that, hardly anything's moved, and what is required in terms of carbon reduction across the globe is basically the level of carbon reduction that we've witnessed during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is basically stopping, pretty much all type of transportation on Earth at any one point. And I don't think people realize what's coming. So taxonomy, good question. If I'm going to make money out of it, I don't know. That's not the aim. We're a mission-driven company, and we want to help the industry to create better buildings, better cities, and more inclusive cities. In terms of our role as being taking the lead on the ESG agenda, we have now enrolled with one of our largest global partners on a test for the taxonomy and what it means tangibly on the ground, for property funds. It's work in progress at the moment, and we'll be issuing a white paper with our thoughts and our findings in the next 6 months.
Mm-hmm. So, Olivier, you are equally also critical towards the taxonomy, as I understood.
Yeah, I think, you really wonder how anybody can think that what we need is innovation, is new ideas. And you really wonder how anybody can think that like framing a document over a 4-year period of time and freezing it for the future is going to help achieve that goal. I think, and as we discussed yesterday, whenever I read it, I have a lot of sympathy for the Brexiters, and I'm a deeply European deep in my heart, and it's really I found it really, really sad that this is. For me, this is the worst thing that comes out of the EU right now, because it's just missing the goalpost so far. It's so far away from what we need that it's just ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. So maybe following on from these obvious shortcomings of the taxonomy, there's I suppose a number of policy and regulatory actions on the way to support the European Green Deal. We're not in the EU, so I don't know what in detail it entails for listed real estate companies, but in general, also referring a bit to what Jonathon Porrit was saying before, industry in general is not known for lobbying for policies and stricter regulation that constrains its business, as it usually means higher cost. But I sometimes wonder, isn't it better to lobby for reaching a level playing field, like an appropriate EU-wide carbon price, for example, as Jonathon Porrit also alluded to, or for example, or then leaving it up to innovation to find the best solutions. Like creating a bit more visibility so you know whether your investments will be rewarded or not. So this may sound a bit naive, but shouldn't investors be more engaged in lobbying for strong climate change regulation, and also make pressure on investee companies to disclose their lobbying efforts around climate change policies and regulation? I don't know what you're doing on this side, Jan Willem, and what should they lobby for?
Yeah, it's a good one, right? So, we as an organization don't really lobby. Of course, like on a European, from a European perspective, it should be a level playing field, right? Because like if the carbon tax in Germany is twice the size of France, you as a German office landlord will have a disadvantage, right? So it needs to be evenly spread across geographies, across sectors. So that's something we definitely would be for, because otherwise it would just distort things in Europe very much.
Mm-hmm. So any other thoughts on lobbying?
I don't know about lobbying. I mean, there clearly needs to be quite a concerted effort across the industry from investors and investees alike to create some significant change quite rapidly. There's a number of investors who've come out very strongly in terms of saying that they are absolutely supporting climate change and want to do the right thing. So some of the biggest investors in the business are doing this. They're very aware of the risks that it's presenting. So there is clearly a weight of capital and a weight of influence that could bring about change. So I would certainly expect to see some of that happening. And is that happening at the moment? I mean, the evidence in terms of policy development would suggest not.
I'm just looking at some of the questions in the chat. I mean, I will just read. Here is a question on any expectations for price movements based on taxonomy-driven demand for eligible stocks. PwC estimates 50% of European assets under management will be in ESG funds by 2025. So I expect that this may create supply-demand effects for eligible stocks. But I don't even know exactly how you're going to be eligible or not eligible based on the taxonomy. But maybe you can shed some light on this, or you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, sorry.
Etienne, go ahead.
Yeah, no, a lot of people, I always laugh when I hear people saying, calling funds ESG funds. ESG is best practice. It's housekeeping. It should be integrated in every company's modus operandi. It's not an asset class. It's an imperative. So I think, again, that perspective needs to change. And to be honest, I think, one company must be quite mad nowadays not to draw an ESG plan for for the way they manage their companies. It's almost like going on a road trip with no sat nav. You need a roadmap on ESG.
So of course, I agree with Etienne, right? So ESG is a consideration. It's a consideration for us, sustainability. So what do we want as a firm? We want to identify and quantify the range of risks of companies that we invest in, and sustainability is just one of those risks. So a company that does not manage its risks properly, we can vote with our feet and we can choose not to invest. And in some cases, that's also what we tend to do. So can you call us ESG? Yes, you can call us ESG, but it's just a label again, right? And it's a very big, important consideration that should be considered by everyone.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I didn't even, when I looked at the taxonomy, understand how or which part of our company or how we would be eligible or not eligible. I just totally don't get it.
I mean, the way it's been structured at the moment, it does rather preclude most of the, any kind of retrofit, anything existing, anything that's being developed to hold all sorts of things. It just doesn't really work at the moment. So. But I think there's also this sort of, we need to sort of step back and think a little bit more fundamentally about what our economy is going to look like if we as we sort of start to push towards a net zero carbon economy. Then that really changes a lot of things, not just about our sector but others. And Jan Willem and others across sector will be looking at all sorts of different sectors and how they're going to be impacted by that, because it means some pretty fundamental change to the economies that we're used to.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, this is like, demographies change. You have like economies. Populations get older. This is like one of those structural changes that we see that is impacting the business that we invest in. And like I said, like we are, we're permanent capital. We invest in companies, REITs that have a permanent capital base. So, since we're off permanent cap, we need to make sure that we invest in the products of tomorrow and of the next 10 to 15 years. And I think that those businesses will be very different, very different.
I mean, what is kind of interesting, is obviously Hamilton is, as other sort of property companies with a retail focus, are going through the mill in terms of experiencing that absolutely radical shift in the retail sector, which has nothing particularly to do with climate change. It's just to do with the evolution of that sector, which has been accelerated so rapidly, and it's uncomfortable, clearly. But it's the similar sort of change that every sector is going to go through in terms of a change around carbon, because it's such a fundamental part of everything that we do around the economy. So once you start thinking of it in those terms, then there needs to be some really kind of deep thinking from the businesses about what you're going to use your real estate, your operating platform in the future, because it's probably going to be very different from what you're using it for now. We as we're looking at development at the moment and design, if you do set those targets, if you do get your design teams to start thinking about what a building is going to need to do and look like in 2030, you get some really interesting conversations and some really interesting results. But that's where we need to be in order to provide the kind of real estate platform that Jan Willem and his colleagues are going to want to invest in and going to be interested in the future.
Yeah, absolutely on this, Louise. And, we talk a lot about the cost of the green economy, but let me just reiterate that it's an opportunity as well. When we put renewable energy installations on existing buildings, for example, with payback periods in some European countries of, 3 to 4 years. I mean, we're talking about a significant opportunity to actually drive value for investors. So, it's also a way of, increasing net operating income for investors, and also there's something that is really interesting that's happened this year in the RICS Red Book, for property valuation, where since the 1st of February there is a special notice for integrating sustainability as part of the valuation process of properties. So now we know that sustainability is not taken into account, and that there is a risk, therefore, not to integrate it in asset level strategies.
Always pleased to be on a webinar that mentions the Red Book.
And I think, presenting the sustainability as an opportunity is what is giving us into that mess in the first place, because we don't want to look at it what it is. It's a risk, and it's going to be a cost. If it was just an opportunity, then I don't even know why we're discussing this. We're just going to size the opportunities. Since when are we waiting for the EU to tell us where to invest to make money? It is not an opportunity. You want to move from a carbonized economy to a decarbonized economy, there's going to be a massive cost associated to that. And unless we accept that, whether it's going to come as a tax or as something else, we're just going to stay where we are, and CO2 is going to keep on crawling up. It is not an opportunity. It will never be. It's an opportunity for people who produce decarbonized things, and there's clearly a new market to compare. But for standing assets, it's a risk and it's a cost.
I think, it's Jonathon Porrit was saying earlier, there's an optimistic view and there's a pessimistic view. there's a realism about it as well. And there are undoubtedly opportunities to do things better, and there are opportunities to invest in different ways. There are also, and being realistic about it, there are also huge costs. The costs will undoubtedly be bigger if you don't do anything about it now. And if you're late to this party and aren't looking at it in a kind of structured, detailed, kind of proper way, then the cost will be higher for you. So there is certainly an opportunity from that point of view.
I think that's a good point.
More about not just the cost, but also the cost if you don't do anything. Right? Maybe there's not enough focus on that.
I think that's a good point, because we can invest in companies that have huge share of governmental tenants, right? If you have a government as a tenant, then obviously that tenant is going to demand that building is of the highest standards available, and otherwise they'll just go somewhere else. I mean, they're going to set the standards, and so there's a cost of not doing something.
Yeah, and I think if we look at it as a liability management tool, so you basically, you address your liability as early as possible in order to limit the cost part of it. I think that's a completely fair view to take. But what I was commenting on is, I mean, this is not a place where everybody is going to be making like massive profit and having a party and enjoy life. This is not what it's going to be. I mean, there is a Swedish company which is an iron manufacturing company, an iron producing company. I mean, they're going to move to net zero. They're going to invest like 4 times the amount of their balance sheet in order to get there over the last 40 years, over the next 20 years. I mean, 4 times the value of their current balance sheet. This is the kind of cost you would need to bear to move to a net zero carbon situation. And that's also true for electricity company, and they're closing a coal power plant and they're writing them off. And that's also going to be true for us. I mean, you need to replace your regular lamp by an LED while your regular lamp is still working. You're just writing off your regular lamp to put an LED in place, and that's a cost. That's not an opportunity.
Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe to wrap up, I mean, I have to say this, like last week, our CEO met with about 30 institutional investors. And I mean, not one of them asked one question about climate change. Maybe it's just a shift of focus because of COVID. But I mean, I just thought, I don't know what to make of it. So maybe just also a question to all the panelists, what you wish your investors would ask you or ask from you, and also to the investors, what you want to hear from the companies, which in spite of all this reporting, you're not hearing maybe?
Here is a piece of advice. Yesterday, I also met with 30 investors, and I have 7 of them asking me about the green dividend. So maybe you want to start doing that, and then you're going to have your CEO getting questions about sustainability.
Okay.
This is totally not like, I think like the companies on this panel do a great job on reporting. We look at companies across the globe. I think reporting in general on ESG metrics is pretty poor still. It's almost like, a company not having to publish their financial results or not having their financial results audited and then telling us, the financial results are great, but, you can't see them. So I think there's still, and it is fairly basic stuff, there's still a lot of work to do when it comes to just reporting on these things and then having the discussion, what are you doing? What are your targets? How do you intend to get there? But this is just basics, and it's definitely not, directed to the 2 companies on the panel because they do a good job on this.
Thank you, we'll take that, won't we, Olivia? But I think, yeah, I mean, it ask the questions. The investors in the meetings with our C-suite, there are undoubtedly more questions being asked now than there were previously. I would be very disappointed if your guys have met with 30 investors and you simply haven't been asked a question at all. Traditionally, I always get used to get told, well, it's fine, we know you're doing a good job, and when things start to go wrong, then we'll ask you questions. But really, the investors should be a little bit more engaged than that now. We have good engagement in terms of investor roadshow work that we do with the investor relations guys. But it's still a work in progress, and there's a big range of knowledge and understanding within the investor community. And whilst there's pressure on the corporates to do all of that reporting and to invest in our teams, then I think there also needs to be an acknowledgement within the investor community that they also need to invest in their teams, because it's impossible for them to really understand what we're doing by expecting us to produce a single number or a certificate or a rating. That's not how you would ever understand the financials. It shouldn't be how you try and understand something as complex as climate change.
So maybe we were just so good, so we didn't get any questions.
I think so. That's what I'd assume anyway.
Yeah. So to wrap up, well, I mean, with the global or with the European carbon tax, we wouldn't need to talk about taxonomy and all that stuff, because the money would flow in the right direction anyway. So we wouldn't actually need any of this transparency stuff. So that's the short summary. Also, I mean, Olivier say it's not about opportunity, it's just about cost, but it's maybe also about the cost if not doing anything. So either way, I think there is still a lot to do, and a lot of discussions to have with the investors, and also maybe a bit more knowledge to be built up on the investor side to understand the challenges that we have. So we have, I've been told I have to be on time. It's 5 to 4 now. The next panel starts at 4:05. So please go and have a coffee or a tea. And we start the next session on the social aspects, which are equally important at 4:05. So thank you very much for the discussion.
Thank you.
Right. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I think we're meant to take it away here. My name is Matthew Olterino. I am part of the UN Environment Program, an initiative called the Finance Initiative, which works with the private finance sector globally to address issues of sustainability within finance practices and large finance institutions. And I coordinate a working group of property investors. It's called our Property Working Group, who are represent global investors active in trying to promote sustainability within their organizations. And so I'm very pleased to be here with you this afternoon, and thankful to or appreciate having received the opportunity to moderate this panel session. And so thanks to Epra for the invitation and for organizing this event. I'm joined by three panelists who I will introduce briefly. And our discussion will focus on the S of ESG, so social issues, in ways in which real estate companies are addressing social gain, social benefit within their organizations, and then outwardly through their investment activities. I will ask a series of questions, but we'll certainly have time for what I hope will be an open-ended discussion between the participants, and then also have the opportunity to field questions from any of you participating this afternoon. Any questions that you may have, please put into the chat function, and then we will field those and feed them out. So to our three panelists, Clément Janine is Group Director of CSR for Unibail Rodamco Westfield. He's worked both as a sustainability or a strategy consultant for sustainability with large companies, and then also having in-house roles in the for corporates such as URW. Daphne Millet has been working in sustainability for the past 15 years, the last 5 of which she's been with Agathe. She has been its CSR director since 2017, and she is a member of Epra's Sustainability Committee in the Corporate Forum on Sustainable Finance. And then lastly, Janine Cole comes to us from Great Portland Estates in the UK. Great Portland Estates have recently launched 2 important strategy statements for which Janine has been instrumental in developing and rolling out. And so the recent launch of The Time Is Now, which is their sustainability statement of intent, and then their net zero carbon roadmap. So welcome to all of you. I'll start by putting out a question for all of you to answer, and to kick us off. We'll start with Janine. And it's really just, I'd like, to hear your definition about the S of ESG. What does it mean as a real estate company to focus on social issues and social gain and social benefit? Janine, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I mean, I think for us, the S in ESG, well, it's all about people really, and how we interact with people right the way across the business. It's how we look at social value and creating a lasting positive social impact on the communities where our buildings are located. It's also making sure that our spaces are inclusive and diverse. And also importantly about supporting health and well-being, and that's not just about health and well-being of our employees, but it's health and well-being of the communities that we're located in, also our occupiers and our supply chain. But I think crucially for us, the S is inextricably linked to the E. If we don't look after the E, then the S normally suffers. And I think that a couple of times today we've heard about climate justice and just transition. And I think that's what makes the E and the S inextricably linked. And so for us, the two go hand in hand.
Great, thank you. Clément, would you like to go next?
Sure. For URW, I would say it's everything that adds value to the local communities in which we operate. I would say that there are then a huge other set of actions that are more internal that I would add to this, that are diversity and inclusion, employee well-being, training our teams on sustainability, defining the right individual objectives, etc. But I think that for what I would like to bring today in terms of adding value to the local communities, we have a global umbrella working on community resilience, and this entails a more specific focus on support to local entrepreneurs, supporting jobs, serving both people that are cut off from the job market and also are meeting our tenants' needs, supporting to local nonprofits, and we add to this a broad topic for local communities, but for communities at large, that is responsible consumption, that we add to this as well.
Great, thank you. Daphne, would you like to weigh in?
Yes, okay. I'm afraid my views will not be very different from the one that has just been expressed. So for us, social issues are both our internal stakeholders, so our employees, and also our external stakeholders, mainly our clients and our suppliers. So as Janine and Clément already said, it's a way to participate in the local economic development and to foster inclusion, especially for the most vulnerable. So it's whether education, support for local jobs, affordability, inclusion of vulnerable population, social, functional, age diversity. It's also addressing new uses, so new user needs, as well as quality of life and of course health and safety. And listen, it's a way of also of listening to our stakeholders' needs. And I totally agree with Janine, E and S really go hand in hand together. And the major challenge we are facing now is to construct or to renovate green buildings that are affordable for people.
Great, thank you. Again, I mean, a question for all of you, and maybe to pick up Janine, partly to pick up Janine's point about focusing on environmental issues supports what you do related to social gain and social benefit and the link between them. But there is a challenge of measuring impact, making it transparent and quantifiable so that stakeholders are clear about the contributions that are being made and that you can take a credit for the things that you're doing. Environmental measuring against environmental metrics is probably the most straightforward if you consider the three parts of ESG integration and management. And governance, has its own logic to it in terms of corporate structure and organization and so forth. Social is arguably the hardest to measure. And I was wondering if I'd like to hear from all of you about strategies that you use. So both perhaps methods that have been applied within your organizations to measure those benefits, but also some of the messaging that you use both internally and externally. And so building support internally for initiatives and making sure that there's an obvious connection in terms of how your organizations say that this contributes to value, and it's important for the way that you respond to investors. Ginny, why don't I start with you again, and perhaps you can kick us off on that.
Sure. I mean, I think you're right. Social impact probably is more difficult to measure, or at least to measure consistently. And I think sort of if you speak to our investors, I think sometimes they find it difficult enough to draw parallels between different businesses and how they measure environmental impact. So I think it is more difficult with social impact. But I think that there's no question that it supports value. occupiers want to be in buildings that act as communities and also that connect with communities. They don't want to be located in sterile environments. And I think that in terms of messaging without the statement of intent that we put out in May, the reason that we have decarbonise the business, climate change resilience, social impact and health and wellbeing is because the four are inextricably linked. So if you take something like biodiversity, it supports health and wellbeing, so supports mental health, supports physical health. It also has a positive impact on the communities, but it can also support climate change resilience, and if used correctly as a nature-based solution, can reduce energy consumption. And so I think that when you're actually starting to try and understand what the value is of social impact, you need to see it as a whole. And I think that probably we spend too much time trying to work out what the value is at a granular level. And actually, it's about the whole story. It's trying to split up sustainability into component parts and ESG into component parts, I think probably is something that we should try and step away from and actually understand how we impact our community as a whole.
All right, thank you. Daphne, would you like to weigh in?
Yes, just to comment on what Janine just said, I agree that social issues are qualitative and it has flaws to always trying to measure things, and sometimes things are not measurable. But if you don't measure things, also it's difficult to monitor them and to act on them. So I guess it's a way to find balance between those two issues. And that's true that social issues are more difficult to measure than environmental ones. Well, I thought so until I read the taxonomy. So no, I'm not really sure about it, but just a quick comment on the previous table. I couldn't help it, sorry. So I think that now social issues has really rise up on the agenda with the COVID. So that's really a good thing because it focuses more the attention on these issues. So that's really something we are working on. There is several ways to measure social impact and to work on it. So for us within ECAD, we are focused on the main way we want to work on it is by implying and involving our stakeholders. And then we have two levels of action. One is business and the other one is philanthropy. And we think that the two levels are complementary, and we are doing actions whether for business, like for example, we are organizing community initiatives in our business parks that are both benefiting our tenants, our office tenants, and also the local community, like job fairs, just to give one example. And also we have purely philanthropic actions, and there are a strong link between the two, and I think the two are complementary. And it's the two words that don't know each other very well, but I think it's really valuable to work on this.
Thank you.
No, so on this topic, we've had a number of discussions internally on how to define the right targets, actually, because as the topic, as has been said before, is not so easy to value, and it's not so easy to find just one KPI that you can use as an overall target. What we did in the past is that because our work has been centered on supporting people into retail jobs, on supporting local NGOs or non-profits, etc., we defined some pretty easy targets to understand for the teams and to follow at a more global level in terms of number of people supported back into jobs, number of NGOs supported in each asset, etc., etc. So pretty easy targets that can be grabbed by the local teams. And that can be worked into programs and real actions on the ground. What we made a shift in 2019 and 2020 to work a bit more on the concept of community resilience, thanks to the long experience that has been developed by our UK teams at Westfield in the UK. For us, this is a shift to something that is more structurally and purposely working towards the needs of local communities. So meaning, instead of having big programs that you roll out group-wide in a number of different countries, etc., trying to have a big impact with one program, what we're saying is that we can support the needs of local communities where we can add value. So we framed a pretty simple methodology for all assets to work on the identification of the key local stakeholders, the key community challenges for each of them, and based on this, set up action plans for each asset team. And so the one of the key is that this methodology needs to be pretty simple, because for us, I mean, the people who actually worked on this are shopping center based teams, so teams that have not a lot of time, and they do not necessarily have a huge knowledge from the beginning about what are all the possible stakeholders that I can work with, etc. They know really well their local communities, but not necessarily all the challenges, etc. And to get everyone on board to the point of how can we make sure that this adds value, etc. We asked all teams to focus on two things. Try to focus on some social impact metrics. So they had to come up with the metrics themselves, trying to imagine what type of social impact or impact for the local communities this project would bring. And keep that as a KPI to track the actual delivery of their action plan and of their projects, and try to see what's the internal operational impact that you can generate with this action plan and with each of these projects. Because it helps making sure that this is mutually beneficial to you as an asset manager locally on the ground, and to the local community as well. And maybe the last thing is that what we realized working on community resilience is that there needs to be a focus, because if you start working on this, you can discover that you have so many challenges you're facing with, so many potential partners you can work with, etc. So you need to keep a strong focus. So we really brought that message to the local teams. And at the same time, we need to recognize that if we really want to integrate ourselves within the local community, we need to be part of a large number of small discussions that take place within the community, small actions. And so we really value as well that the local asset teams can be part of these multiple small interactions that help ensure that our assets are really a part in the community discussions.
Great, thank you. That's great insight. Maybe just a quick follow-up to anyone who wants to take it. I mean, it sounds like obviously there's, there's efforts within each of your organizations to come up with the right metrics and to communicate effectively. At the same time, there's, arguably a proliferation of reporting activities for which you're being asked to respond to. Do you see merit? Do you see a possibility of some sort of narrowing down, particularly as it relates to social benefit, social gain, social impact, in terms of what you report, how you report it, or will it necessarily remain a very localized and sort of, very, very much tailored to local circumstances and the communities in which you operate? So I guess, is there a possibility for perhaps core metrics, convergence toward a few things, or is that not realistic for measuring and communicating this this type of benefit? Anyone who wants to say something on that?
So I guess there's scope to develop core metrics that we can all report against, and sort of the Epra SBPR have already started to do that through their reporting. And so I think there are some core metrics that we can all align with. I think the difficulty is when you try and use a one-size-fits-all approach. Even within real estate, our businesses are all very different, and also the causes that we support and the initiatives that we support are all going to differ. So I think trying to align along a sort of a single methodology is going to be difficult. And if we can't do it on environmental, I don't see that we're ever going to be able to do it on social. So I think it is about getting the narrative right, but also identifying a few metrics that we can all report against. And as I say, I think the Epra SBPR have actually tried to do a good job of that.
I think if I can add to this, so what you're saying, Janine, somehow is that we need to have a balance between KPIs that are going to be used at a very local level, and that can differ depending on the outputs, the type of social impact that you're trying to generate, and I'm pretty in line with this. And at the same time, as you said as well, we need to have 1 or 2, 3 key metrics that we can all report. And I think that this is exactly where we are currently at URW. We're trying to do both. And for having been involved in social impact measurement as well on the side, I think that this is really something we need to take care of, is that because these projects are all different, because we are trying to generate outputs that are all different, we need to make sure that we don't end up with only 1 or 2 metrics, because this is going to drive internally as well the targets towards something that may not make sense everywhere or for all companies. We are, for example, here around the table on very different types of asset classes and types of real estate. So it makes sense as well that we have some different types of outputs that we are trying to generate with our social impact strategies. And then somehow, when we discuss with investors, and this is typically the point of the SBPR and other types of reporting initiatives, definitely we need to come up with a few key figures. They might be different for types of asset classes, but we need to have some. And for the moment at URW, we are not 100% clear on what this should be for the future. We have some that we report for a few years already. But we are working on what the next generation of these KPIs are going to be.
Thanks.
Just to add up on that, I think I just read a study done by Exane on the real estate sector, and he done quite a benchmark of all the environmental and social indicators. And what was striking is that there is not a lot of social indicators that really make sense, nor there are common ones. So I think the studies that Clément started might be very inspiring for all of us. So maybe that's something we can work on together, because we are also working on that currently. I recently recruited someone in my team to be fully dedicated to social impact, because I think we can do a lot more better than we are doing now. I think we are also working on small actions, and that makes sense, and we should not stop them. But I think we also have to work on the bigger picture. So that's what we are working on right now. So to give a broader vision on the social impacts, and trying to find new KPIs also on that, which I know it will be very difficult. So I will be happy if Epra can be also a room for exchanging on that.
Thank you. Those are great answers. And so I'm going to pick up or start to weave in something that Clément mentioned, which is the fact that you do have different asset types and very different profiles across your organizations. And so arguably, for example, I know, ECOD, some of your investment activities are focused on, let's call them the social sector. I mean, health clinics and so forth. And you could, for institutions that might focus on sort of, moderate priced or, middle income housing, things of that nature, arguably there's an inherent social gain through that investment activity that may not be it's clearly identifiable as some of the other sectors. And so, I suspect there are some challenges around that. But maybe I'll just pick up one question, also dealing with challenges and very acute challenges at the moment. And this is coming through the chat. And so the sector is under some financial pressure. Perhaps more pronounced in certain areas than in others. I mean, retail not to single anyone out here. You know, perhaps more than others, but I mean, obviously you look at office tenants and you know, pressure that you're getting about rent relief and that type of thing. And so, you know, you've got your core profitability, you know, you have need to be profitable, obviously. And, you know, what challenges, I guess, are you finding to make sure that those connections with social benefit or maintaining your attention to social gain, you know, doesn't diminish during these difficult financial periods, such as what we're facing now? I don't know if anyone who wants to pick that up.
I can pick it up because it's probably also you mentioned the retail sector, and I think that this is a really good question for us. I think that it's definitely a challenge because we are at the same time in a period where, and our CEO said it in April or May this year as well during the first lockdown in France, we are at a moment where social issues and environmental issues have never been so pressing. I mean, they have always been, but now I think that there is a bigger focus and a bigger understanding of them at the moment. So I think that this is what the first part of the equation. And the second thing is we need to make sure that we operate with the right amount of CapEx, OpEx, etc. And there is a big pressure on this as well at the moment. But I think that working on this, there are ways to make sure that we work in the most clever possible way, and our partners understand it on the ground as well. So I think that the key to this is being extremely transparent on the things that you can or you can't do. Maintain the relationship at a local level with good quality. And I think that at the same time, I mean, everyone understands the situation in which we are at the moment. So it's really a question of making sure that you work in a community that has strong bonds. And I think that this is also the point of community resilience, because we are all in this situation together. So it's about having the right plans, discussing them with the local communities, and trying to find the right, I would say, balance between what you can do, the means that you have available, and the expectations that are on the other hand. So for me, the key is really dialogue, engaging at a local level on these plans, and making sure that your points are clearly being understood, etc.
Great, thank you. I want to pick up something that's come through the chat, and then this will lead into another question that particularly I have for Daphne, and so it's I'll just read it out. The panel, you know, does the panel think that there's a distinction between social impact as an investment strategy and the S in ESG? Anyone want to take that on?
I can give a first shot at it. I think there, because I think it's completely different to invest in vehicles or in companies. The first purpose of which is to generate social impact, and investing in companies that are also generating social impact, like my company, for example. But the first intent of the company is not to generate social impact in the way it's being understood by social impact funds, for example. So I think that it makes the entire structure of the company being completely different in terms of how you organize yourself, what's the type of social benefits you're trying to generate through your activity. So obviously, if you look at retail activities, they are a social activity per se, but the purpose of retail is not to generate, I would say, positive social impact per se, which is, I think, the key difference with a social business, for example.
Sure. Anyone else want to take a stab at that?
Yes, I think I agree with what Clément just said, but I think that even for social business, they are asked to have very social, responsible way to do it. So they have also the same constraints. And I'm thinking about our business of healthcare. We are a healthcare property investor. And we, of course, the purpose of the company is to have social impact on access on health and also access on care for elderly people. But we are expected to do it in a socially and environmentally responsible way also, and it's really normal to do that, of course. So maybe sometimes you maybe have more scrutiny on this aspect because your actions are totally dedicated to social impact. So there will be more scrutiny on what if you are doing things well.
So maybe let me jump into a follow-up that I indicated in advance I'd want to ask you about, which is your social bond. And so ECAD has recently, and just please correct me on this, Stephanie, if I'm not saying this correctly, but recently issued a social bond. And given that you just mentioned your healthcare business, and so there's an inherent social that business line is fixed to social benefit. And so on that basis, I guess you're already within the broad structure of the bond in terms of thinking about use of proceeds. Can you say anything about that process? In other words, how, why did the company choose that route as a different capital raising strategy? Were there pricing benefits? Did it open up a broader pool of investors? But also, were there different expectations then that came from issuing a social bond, that in effect are over and above what you might consider, how the company would, what benefit or gain it would typically deliver through those investment activities?
Yes, so ECAD Santé, the subsidiary dedicated to healthcare, has recently emitted a social bond. So we have already emitted for ECAD Group a green bond a few years ago, but the principles were quite different because this time the whole activity is dedicated to social impact. So the way we approached it was quite different. Because all the assets were eligible, all the assets of ECAD Santé were eligible to the financing of the proceeds. So of course we align with best practices, with social bond principles, and reviewing of a second party opinion. So that is the best practices and quite normal practices now. So we really thought how we could add value on this bond, because it was a way for us to show to investors what is a social impact. So we looked at it in two different ways. First of all, to go beyond what is required, we limit ourselves to refinancing of existing eligible expenditure not older than 3 years. That's a really important point for investors, not to refinance assets that are too old. So that was the first point. And the second point was on our commitment to report on social impact indicators. So we would go beyond what we reported until then on social impact. So we really looked also at what has been done on other social bonds. There was not a lot of them. So we tried to add value and add new indicators to give more sense to the investors to what they are financing and what would be their social impact. So it was a very interesting work we've done with the ECAD Santé department and the financial teams, because that make us think what are really our social impact. And I think we haven't thought it through until then, well, not on this comprehensive way. So I think it was really interesting, and we had very interesting discussion with investors around it. And it was a way to tell the story and to explain also to investors who don't know the French healthcare system, how the private sectors really have an impact on all people and give access to all people on this social, on this medical care. And it was a way for us to explain it to investors that are not aware of this particular system. So I think it was quite a great success for us, because the pricing conditions were very good. Well, it was exceptional to say the truth. So maybe there was a bit of luck in this, because we emitted it in September, so it was in between the two lockdowns, so we were quite lucky. But this bond was oversubscribed 10 times, so there was a great appetite for it. 10 times was something we never saw within ICAD, and we had very good pricing conditions. So I think that it is both related to the activity by itself, which has proven to be resilient during the crisis. I think there was an appetite on that, but also because this is a really rare product, so there is a very few social bonds for corporate issuers. So I think investors were also really were keen on investing in this kind of product. So it has been a really good experience for ICAD Santé, both in financial perspective, of course, but also to think and to communicate on our social impact.
Great, thank you. I want to pose a similar question to both Janine and Clément. I'll have Clément go first, but it has to do with I guess your sense of place, right? So in other words, URW is at least amongst this panel is certainly the most geographically diversified, and you might find that you face different expectations or different regulatory drivers or market drivers in the countries that you operate related to social benefit. So I wonder if you can say something, about those differences that you find between countries. And then on the other hand, Janine, I mean, Great Portland Estates is very much, fixed and tied to London, and how that informs your strategies. And, maybe it'd be interesting to hear the differences between the two. So Clément, do you want to start?
Sure. Maybe to add a bit of a contextual element, our geographical footprint is ranging from the US, so mostly large cities in the US and Europe. So yes, obviously there are very strong differences. These differences for me are both cultural and linked to the very local economic conditions. I can't really speak for general differences between countries because for me it really depends on each topic, whether you talk about employment, about poverty, about the different social aspects that you want to work with. But what I really want to say here is that it's absolutely essential to consider that there are these differences and that the differences are in fact extremely local. They are not to be looked at country level. And this is one of the learnings we made. I just want to use one example on this to explain you this. Maybe it's due to our corporate culture or maybe to our very French centralized culture. We defined an amazing program that is still live today that is called URW for Jobs. So we have global guidelines, a process, etc. that has been designed in the past to help countries pre-work as much as we could to help onboard local teams on implementing this program. And over the years, more and more, we started to get questions from the local teams on the fact that they were not sure that the target groups were the right ones. For example, in Central Europe, they had a lot more issues around people aged 50 plus getting jobs, where the entire program was focused on young people, because this was, I think, a cultural bias that we had from France. With a high unemployment from young people. We ended up having additional questions from other countries where it was regulatorily impossible to gather data on the social impact of the program, meaning it was impossible to follow a cohort of people and trying to know over time after 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, if they ever got employed and if they were still employed in the same job, if it was a different one, etc. So in the end, we had to recognize that each country and even more precisely, each city, so employment basin, I don't know if this is a real English word, but that's what we say in French, had its own context and that our program needed to adapt to this. So this is obviously what we did. So over time, we brought a lot of flexibility into the program, but making sure that we could still track the key KPIs that we really wanted to get out of this program in terms of social impact. And this is also what has been driving us towards this community resilience approach that I mentioned before, because we recognize that local context is extremely important and that this is by taking care of this local context that you generate the most social value in the end with your program.
Thank you. Janine?
So I think what we found actually is that the being based in London, and we kept pretty close to the London boroughs and to the various communities that we work with, and we've established long-standing relationships, and our community strategy really came out of those long-standing relationships and conversations with the local boroughs, where we wanted to understand from them what they felt their priorities were, and so which led to our focus on youth homelessness, air quality and urban greening, education and skills, and also modern slavery actually. And I think that that is to do with our geographical location, and I think it's sort of best illustrated really. We created a COVID community fund from contributions from our board directors, executive committee, and the wider GPU team. And what happened through that community fund is that people who we were already talking with, we were able to sort of build on those relationships, and one specific organisation were really struggling, that we'd been working with on urban greening projects in Southwark as a borough. We knew them really well. And actually what happened was they had to furlough a number of their staff. They had to close some of the parks that they were working with. And because we had that long-standing relationship with them, we were able to support them to open up those parks in Southwark again, which really helped support the community, bring some of their people back off furlough. And I think what that sort of helped demonstrate is that long-term relationship, and really sort of getting inside the borough and understanding what was going on meant that at a crisis point, we were able to go in and support them where it was most needed. And similarly, a corporate charity partner we work with, Groundwork London, we were supporting urban greening projects with them. They had to put a project on ice. They were able to come to us and say, do you know what we actually need to do at the moment is invest to support some community volunteer hubs for the COVID pandemic. And we also have some refugee communities who aren't able to self-isolate because they don't have basic white goods like washing machines, fridges, that sort of thing. So we were able to divert that fund really quickly to them to help support. And I think in part that is to do with the fact that we are operating in a small geographical area. We know our boroughs really well, and we're able to kind of listen to those communities and work really quickly. And so I think that probably is probably how our approach maybe slightly differs.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting.
But I think to react to what you just said, Janine, this is exactly what we need to be doing, even though we are an international business and operating on both sides of the Atlantic. And that's the point of having the type of community resilience programs that we're having, is because we need to make sure that this, I would say, detailed understanding of the needs of your very local partners in every place where you operate is exactly, I would say, to that level, to exactly what you described. And I think that this is really something that is difficult to organize for international companies, but I think that this is what we should aim for, because this is exactly where you generate that value, and this is where you contribute as a business to the local resilience, exactly in the situation where we are at the moment with the COVID crisis, but also on a longer term. Because jobs, for example, are supposed to last a lot more than just going through the crisis, for example. So completely in line with what you're saying.
So we need to wrap up. We've got, we'll call it 3 minutes left, so 1 minute for each of you. I'll start with Janine, but same question to all of you. Tell me a little bit about, sort of the big topic hanging over us right now. What do you feel has changed or needs to change as we get this health crisis under control, buildings start to repopulate and so forth? And obviously, we talked about some of the financial pressures. So how's the landscape different? And what are going to be some priorities coming up, say, over the next 6 to 12 months? Janine?
So I think the landscape generally has changed. I think there is a brighter light on social impact than there was before. More generally, I think there's more focus, more questions coming from investors on the social impact now. In terms of the GPE priorities, I'm not sure that the GPE priorities as such have changed. We've been focused on health and wellbeing, we've been focused on mental health, we've been focused on homelessness and all those sorts of causes that need support during the pandemic. I think what it's done is probably helped us realise the need to double down and focus our efforts in those areas even more so than we were already. And I think that probably what we've also done is really learned from our community fund actually, and started to understand some of the other causes that we should get involved with. So really quick examples, sort of literacy projects and that sort of thing that we've really sort of started to understand as part of that crisis, I think. So I think just more and more quickly, but along similar themes is probably where we're going, and we'll be responding to more questions on those themes.
Thank you. Daphne, can I turn it to you? 1 minute.
Yes, well, I would say the same thing. We need to accelerate on social impact. So that's what I said earlier. We just recruited 1 people dedicated to this subject. So we will, you will hear from us in the next few months, hopefully, with a broader vision on this aspect. And I think what we have learned also during this crisis is that we really need to focus on the customers' needs, to react very quickly to their needs at the moment, because there was really a short-term situation to handle, but also to have a long-term vision on this kind of issues. What do we want to address? Where is our impact? Where are we legitimate to act? So that's why we are trying to work now.
Thank you. Last words, Clément?
I'm going to agree, obviously, with what Janine and Daphne said. Clearly, community is getting back center stage, and I think that the discussions that we've had with investors over the past 9 to 12 months have brought that very clearly. I think that we spent a lot more time discussing these topics than we did over the past 2-3 years. I think that this has brought a lot of flexibility and adaptability, to bounce back on what Daphne just said, also because I think that from a social perspective, the social systems and the state support have been and are being very different from one country to another. So it requires from us to make sure that we understand, really well the social conditions in the different countries where we operate, to make sure we can adjust to this. And maybe one last interesting point is that although I think that from a business perspective, obviously tenant discussions are being tough and have been tough for some of them. But we've never had as many discussions with tenants so far on sustainability. We are having very active discussions on energy efficiency, on waste management, on responsible consumption, etc. So I think that there is also something moving here in the feeling overall that we are one big community. This may be special to the retail space, but maybe not. And that we are really partners on sustainability topics.
Thank you. Well, great messages there. I like the tenant engagement, the doubling down on the things that you're presently doing. So these are great insights. I'm very, very thankful to our panelists who could share their time and expertise. I'm going to turn it over to Hassan, if he'll allow me another 30 seconds for a shameless plug. We didn't spend a whole lot of time on health and well-being issues. And just to announce that UNEP-FI, our property working group, do have a project that's looking at health and wellness as a value driver in real estate, and trying to pick up perceptions from the investment community on that particular topic. So we'll issue something probably in February. Gloria and Hassan are we try to continually update them on what we're doing at UNEP-FI, and so I'm sure that will be shared out through the Epra network when it's available. But again, thank you all for listening, for those joining in, and then to our panelists as well. So I'll turn over to Hassan to wrap up, and thank you.
Great. Thank you, Matthew, for moderating the last panel. It was indeed very inspiring, and we all finished this afternoon with good lessons learned. There's certainly still a lot to do in ESG, and every stakeholder of the real estate sector has a role to play at many levels.
Our ambition of a more sustainable sector must not fall behind the urge to tackle the difficulties facing the real estate industry in these times of global pandemic. We are ending a troubled year, but hopefully 2021 will bring brighter days to our sector. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now the end of the virtual event, and I hope that after this condensed afternoon, you will share my enthusiasm regarding the content of what our speakers offered. I want to thank all the stakeholders who participated in this event, our interviewees, Jonathon Porrit and Stefan Moser, and the interviewer, Anya Sitaram, as well as all our speakers and moderators of the panel. Thank you to the Epra ESG and events team for their support in organizing this virtual event. And thank you to all our attendees for listening to our speakers today. I would also like to take this opportunity to inform our attendees that we will be hosting the last Epra webinar of the year next week on Monday, 7th December at 13:30 Central European Time. This webinar will be dedicated to the recently released study about the total tax contribution of listed real estate investment trusts in Europe, and we will be hosting this in partnership with PwC. And last but not least, don't forget to register for our one or more of our 4 Insights events 2021 that will be held online early January. Agendas and links to the register are available on the Epra website. Thank you again for your time and looking forward to meeting you again in 2021. Thank you. Bye.